Hey guys, tonight we are traveling back to 18th century France to witness what was supposed to be the wedding of the century. Imagine a world drenched in gold leaf, powdered wigs so tall they're a fire hazard, and enough courtly intrigue to make a modern reality show look like a boring documentary. You're about to be a fly on the wall at the Palace of Versailles. But a word of warning in this world of suffocating corsets, baffling etiquette, and nonexistent plumbing. Your 21st century sensibilities and maybe your lungs might not last the first day. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And while you're at it, let me know in the comments what city you're in and what time it is for you right now. I love seeing where you're all tuning in from. Now, dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum. And let's ease into tonight's journey together. The year is 1770. You find yourself standing in the glittering, almost blindingly bright hall of mirrors at Versailles. Take a deep breath. You can smell it, touch that unique, intoxicating, and frankly, slightly gross perfume of the era, a mix of expensive floral scents, roasting meats from the kitchens, the subtle dust from 1,000 silk gowns, and the undeniable aroma of hundreds of bodies packed a little too closely together. This isn't just any party. This is the culmination of a massive political chess move. For centuries, your home, France, ruled by the Bourbon dynasty, has been at odds with the powerful Habsburg dynasty of Austria. They've been like two heavyweight boxers, constantly circling each other, trading blows, and draining the continent's resources. But now, the old king, Louis XV, has decided to try something different. Instead of war, a wedding, a joining of the two houses. The plan is simple, almost elegant in its design. Marry his grandson and heir, the 15-year-old Louis August, to the 14-year-old daughter of the Austrian Empress, Maria Antonia. This is our mainstream history fact for the night. This marriage was less about love and more about creating a lasting peace treaty with a human seal. The goal was twofold, and the rivalry and, most importantly, produce a male heir to secure the French line of succession. No pressure, kids. You crane your neck, trying to catch a glimpse of the couple, and there they are. First, the Dauphin, Louis August. H.E.S. Well, H.E.S. not exactly the fairy tale prince you might have imagined. He's a bit shy, a little stocky, with a kind but perpetually uncertain look on his face. He seems more at home in a dusty workshop tinkering with locks, which is his actual hobby, than here, under the gaze of every important person in Europe. He shuffles his feet, his eyes darting anywhere but towards his new bride. He looks, to be honest, like a teenager who's been forced to attend his parents' office party. And then you see her, the Dauphin, who will soon be known to the world as Marie Antoinette. She is radiant, a delicate doll-like figure swimming in a sea of silken diamonds. But if you look closer, past the powdered hair and the rosy cheeks, you can see the same flicker of panic in her eyes. She is in a foreign land, surrounded by a language she barely speaks, and court etiquette so complex it requires a manual. You overhear the courtiers whispering around you. They're dissecting her every feature. Is her forehead too high? Is her Austrian lip to pronounce? They aren't just being mean, they're assessing a political asset. And this brings us to a wonderfully weird and telling little piece of trivia about this whole affair. A few weeks ago, on a specially constructed island in the middle of the Rhine River, the symbolic border between their two worlds, Maria Antonia underwent a bizarre ceremony. She was taken into a tent and stripped of everything Austrian: her clothes, her jewels, her ribbons, even her friends and her beloved pet pug, Mux. She walked in as an Austrian archduchess and walked out, dressed head to toe in French fashion, as the Dauphin of France. It was a complete rebranding, a symbolic death and rebirth, a stark reminder that from that moment on, she was no longer herself. She was a vessel for the future of France. As the lavish, multi-day celebration drones on, with its endless banquets and stuffy operas, you can feel a strange tension beneath the surface. Officially, The French people are overjoyed. There are fireworks, free wine fountains in Paris, and cheering crowds. But was this joy real? Here's where historians still argue. Some say the French were genuinely hopeful that this alliance would bring stability and an end to costly wars. Others argue that there was a deep-seated suspicion of this Austrian girl, a the Austrian woman. From the very beginning, for generations, they'd been taught to distrust the Habsburgs. And old habits die hard. Was the public applause a genuine welcome? Or was it the polite, mandatory clapping you do when you know the king is watching your every move? Well, likely never know for sure. The long day finally wears on. The feasts have been eaten. The music has faded. Now comes the most public, most awkward, and most crucial part of the entire wedding spectacle, the public bedding ceremony. You, along with a select group of high-ranking courtiers, follow the young couple to their bedroom. This isn't a private moment. It's the final act of the political performance. The archbishop blesses the bed. The king himself hands the groom his nightshirt. The highest-ranking duchess hands the bride hers. They are tucked into bed, and the curtains are drawn, with the entire court looking on, expecting them to, well, get on with the business of making an heir. The weight of an entire kingdom, of a continental peace, now rests on the shoulders of two nervous teenagers. Alone in that grand, imposing bed for the very first time, you can almost feel the silence outside that curtain, thick with anticipation. The heavy velvet curtains around the bed don't block out the morning light. They just turn it into a hazy, dusty gold. The courtiers are gone. The palace is slowly stirring back to life with the clatter of servants and the distant chime of a clock. In the grand silence of the royal bedchamber, the air is thick with the unspoken. Nothing happened. The great, history-making, air-producing event that an entire continent was holding its breath for simply failed to launch. Let's get a better look at our two protagonists, now that the crowd has dispersed. First, there's Louis Auguste. If you were to cast the role of a dashing French monarch, you wouldn't pick him. H.E.S. not athletic. H.E.S. not suave. H.E.S. not a charismatic leader of men. H.E.S. a quiet, serious boy who is painfully aware that he doesn't fit the mold. His grandfather, the reigning king Louis XVI, is the epitome of a flamboyant, pleasure-seeking ruler, with a string of official mistresses and a court dedicated to decadent leisure. Louis Auguste is a direct, almost stubborn, reaction against all that. H.E.S. devoutly religious, morally upright, and deeply uncomfortable with the very idea of scandal or excess. His real passions lie far from the ballroom or the boudoir. Give him a complex lock to pick, and he's happy. He has a fully equipped workshop right in the palace where he spends hours hunched over metal workings. His hands greasy, his mind focused. This is our key historical point. Louis's love for locksmithing wasn't just a quaint hobby, it was an escape. It was a world of logic, mechanics, and tangible problems that could be solved with patience and skill. Unlike, say, court politics or the expectations of a new wife. He also loves poring over maps, studying naval charts, and going on long, exhausting hunts. Notice a theme: these are all solitary activities. He is a man infinitely more comfortable with things than with people. He is, by all accounts, a good, well-intentioned man. The tragedy is that a good man is not always the right man to be king, especially in a time that would demand decisiveness and a commanding presence. And then there's her, Marie Antoinette. She is his complete opposite. Where he is hesitant, she is graceful. Where he is silent, she is bubbly. Raised in the relatively relaxed and family-oriented Austrian court, she was brought up to be charming, to dance beautifully, to play music, and to delight a room with her presence, and she excels at all of it. She possesses a natural charisma that Louis completely lacks, but her education was, to put it mildly, lacking in substance. Her mother, the formidable Empress Maria Theresa, often lamented in her letters that her youngest daughter was frivolous and lazy with her studies. Here's a little tidbit that shows the gap between her preparation and her reality. While she spoke French passably, her grasp of the country's history, its politics, and its intricate social structure was almost non-existent. She was trained to be an ornament, not a stateswoman. She was a performer who had just been thrust into the most demanding role of her life with very little rehearsal. She was supposed to charm and secure the affections of her husband and, through him, the French court. But her target audience of one was proving immune to her charms. She would smile, and he would look away. She would try to start a light-hearted conversation, and he would mumble a one-word reply before finding an excuse to retreat to his workshop. So you have this impossible dynamic. A shy, nerdy boy who finds social interaction excruciating, paired with a vivacious social butterfly who lives for interaction and approval. It's a recipe for disaster. She, stranded and lonely, feels his withdrawal as a personal rejection. He, overwhelmed and insecure, sees her effortless social grace as yet another reminder of his own inadequacies. This is where historical debate really heats up. What was the root of this initial catastrophic failure to connect? Was it simple teenage awkwardness, magnified by the immense pressure they were under? Some historians argue that Lewis was genuinely intimidated, even terrified, of this beautiful, confident young woman who represented a world of physical and emotional intimacy he was completely unprepared for. He was a boy who knew how to fix a clock but had no idea how to talk to a girl. Others propose a more psychological block, a deep-seated aversion to the legacy of his grandfather's promiscuity, making him almost phobic about sexuality itself. A third school of thought, which we'll explore later, wonders if there was a minor physical issue at play. Whatever the cause, the result was the same: a cavernous distance between the two people who were supposed to be the most intimate couple in the kingdom. That distance wouldn't remain a private matter for long. In a place like Versailles, a private failure is a public spectacle in the making. The silence in their bedroom was about to become the loudest gossip in France, and every courtier was leaning in, pressed to the door, waiting to hear what happened next, or more accurately, what didn't. Now let's pull the camera back a bit from the royal bedroom and take in your new home, the Palace of Versailles. Forget any modern notion of a home or privacy. Versailles is not a house, it's a stage. It's a glittering, golden, suffocating fishbowl. And you, as the future king and queen, are the prize fish. Every single aspect of your life is public property, governed by a rigid, centuries-old set of rules known as Etiquette. This is the core of our historical understanding for this chapter. The etiquette of Versailles was not just about being polite. It was a complex system of political control invented by Louis XIV, the Sun King, a century earlier. The goal was to domesticate the powerful French nobility by forcing them to live at the palace and compete for trivial honors like the right to hold the king's candlestick as he went to bed, or to hand the queen her chemise when she dressed. He kept them busy, drunk, and dependent on his favor. They were too busy jockeying for position at court to be at home on their own estates plotting rebellions. It was a brilliant system, but for you, living at its center, it's a nightmare. Imagine your morning. You don't just wake up. You are woken. The first event of your day is the lever, the official rising ceremony. A procession of people, ranked by their noble status, is allowed into your bedroom in waves. The most privileged get to see you actually get out of bed. The next tier sees you put on your breeches. The next, your wig. Every gesture is ritualized. The simple act of getting dressed can take an hour and involve dozens of people, all watching, silently, judging. For Marie Antoinette, this was a particularly jarring shock. Here's a perfect, almost comical, example of this system in action. One morning during her Gilded, the public dressing ceremony, her lady-in-waiting was about to hand her the chemise. But just then, a higher-ranking duchess entered the room. Etiquette dictated that the duchess had the right to perform this task, so the chemise was passed to her. But before she could hand it to the queen, an even higher-ranking royal princess came in. The duchess had to pass the chemise to the princess. Oh, the royal. Poor Antoinette is standing there, half-dressed and shivering, waiting for these women to sort out their pecking order. She later complained in a letter home. It is all so ridiculous. She was strong. This is what we mean by a transparent lolo, a gilded cage. There are no walls to protect you. Courtiers listen at doors. Servants are paid to report on your conversations. Every meal you eat. Every card game you play. Every walk you take in the garden is observed by hundreds, if not thousands, of eyes. Your personal letters are often opened and read before they even leave the palace. And this brings us to the juicy, weird little fact of palace life. There were no secrets because there was almost no private space. The grand apartments had huge, sweeping corridors that were open to the public. On any given day, thousands of people, aristocrats, servants, tradesmen, petitioners, and even tourists wandered through the palace. They did look at the art, gossip in the hallways, and try to catch a glimpse of the royals. It was like living in a modern museum, except the exhibits are you and your family. There were even vendors who set up stalls inside the palace, selling everything from farms to lemonade. The result, the palace was perpetually noisy, crowded, and filthy. People would relieve themselves in the hallways or behind curtains because there were notoriously few toilets. So add that to your sensory memory of Versailles, the faint, ever-present smell of air unmingling with the perfume and dust. This culture of zero privacy is precisely why Louis and Antoinette's marital problems couldn't be contained. The state of the royal marriage wasn't just gossip, it was a matter of national importance, and everyone felt they had a right to know. Did the Queen look pale this morning? Did the King seem sullen at dinner? Did they exchange a crossword? Every nuance was analyzed for meaning. And this is where we hit another point of historical debate. Did this crushing lack of privacy actively contribute to their problems? Many historians argue yes. Absolutely. For a shy man like Louis, the pressure of knowing that his performance, or lack thereof, in the bedroom would be the subject of nationwide speculation the next day must have been paralyzing. This wasn't just first-night jitters, it was a recurring performance anxiety on a geopolitical scale. For Antoinette, a young girl desperate for affection and already feeling like an outsider, the cold, clinical observation of her every move only increased her sense of isolation. It's hard to imagine how any relationship could blossom under such conditions. They were two lonely teenagers, trapped in a golden cage, surrounded by smiling vultures. Every morning, the question was the same. The servants would check the bed sheets for the telltale signs of a consummated marriage standard. If mortifying, practice for royal couples. And every morning, for days, then weeks, then months, the report was the same. Nothing. The whispers in the hallways grew louder, turning from curious speculation into snide, derisive jokes. The clock was ticking, not just on their marriage, but on the credibility of the future monarchy itself. The grand, gilded clock in the antechamber ticks with an agonizing slowness. It feels like its gears are grinding out the seconds of your humiliation. This isn't just the wedding night anymore. It's become a recurring ordeal. Every evening, the same suffocating ritual unfolds. The procession to the bedroom, the stilted ceremony of being undressed by the highest-ranking nobles, the polite but knowing smiles that feel more like smirks. The archibald's blessing starts to sound less like a prayer and more like a gentle, ecclesiastical taunt. As the heavy curtains are drawn shut, you are once again alone with your stranger spouse. The silence inside the cocoon of fabric is deafening. The sheer scale of the bed itself is absurd. It's more like a small, upholstered field than a place for intimacy. You can practically feel the weight of expectation from everyone on the other side of that velvet. They're all out there, you know. Not literally standing outside the curtain all night, but their presence lingers. They're waiting, listening, hoping to overhear a sigh, a rustle, anything that suggests the great work, as they call it, is underway. This is the central point to grasp. The consummation of a royal marriage was not a private act of love, it was a public, political duty. The Latin term for it was copula carnalis, a carnal joining, and it was the final, legally binding step of the marriage contract. Without it, the union could, in theory, be annulled, and an annulment would be a diplomatic catastrophe. undoing the entire peace treaty with Austria, embarrassing both monarchies, and potentially plunging Europe back into conflict. All of this is resting on you. Louis, a boy who, at this moment, would probably rather be figuring out the mechanics of a new Swiss-made watch. You look at your wife. Marie Antoinette lies there, perfectly still, a vision of youthful beauty in her fine linen nightgown. But you can sense the tension in her posture. Is she disappointed? Is she disgusted? You can treat her expression in the dim candlelight filtering through the fabric. Your mind is a whirlwind of inadequacy. You are the future king of France. You command armies in theory. You are the descendant of the great Sun King. Yet you are failing at the one task any peasant in your kingdom can perform without a second thought. The pressure builds. A physical weight in your chest. It's a classic case of performance anxiety. But the stage is the whole of Europe. And the critics are vicious. You retreat into yourself, into the safe, quiet world of your own thoughts. You might feign sleep. Or perhaps you just lie there, rigid, staring into the darkness until dawn, praying for the morning to come and release you. And here's a quirky, sad little detail about this whole mess. In the initial days and weeks, the court was, in a way, sympathetic. They chalked it up to youth and nerves. The official court gazette even published a small, face-saving lie. After the first night, a brief statement was released announcing that the marriage had been perfectly consummated. But this was a flimsy patch on a rapidly growing hole. You can't fake a pregnancy. As weeks turn into months with no sign of a swelling belly on the Dauphin, the lie becomes transparently, ineffably false. This is where historical interpretation becomes crucial. Why did Louis fail? Some biographers, looking at his behavior, suggest he was afflicted with what was then called melancholy, what we might now call clinical depression, his lethargy, his social withdrawal, his inability to act all classic symptoms. Others, however, focus on the sheer, overwhelming pressure. They argue that any 15-year-old boy, no matter how robust, would falter under such intense, public scrutiny. He wasn't just being asked to be intimate with a girl, he barely knew he was being asked to perform a dynastic sacrament on command. It's like trying to write a beautiful poem with a screaming crowd watching over your shoulder, tapping their feet impatiently. From Antoinette's perspective, the experience is one of profound confusion and humiliation. She has done everything she was trained to do. She is beautiful. She is charming. She is present. His failure to approach her feels like her failure. Is she not desirable enough? Did she do something wrong in the cruel calculus of court politics? A queen's primary value is in her fertility. A barren queen is a defective queen. She is failing at her one and only job. And she doesn't understand why. The warmth and affection she was used to in the Austrian court has been replaced by the cold, assessing gaze of Versailles. And the one person who should be her partner, her ally in this foreign land, is as distant as a star. So the night ends as it began, in silence. The first rays of sun creep under the curtains. Soon, the ritual will begin again in reverse. The courtiers will enter, their faces carefully neutral, but their eyes sharp, searching for any clue. They will find none. The bed sheets will once again be a silent testament to failure. You will both get dressed, go to mass, and endure another day of feigned normalcy, of forced smiles and polite conversation, all while knowing that every single person you see is thinking about what didn't happen last night. The performance isn't over, it's just moved from the bedroom to the grand halls of the palace. And you'll have to do it all over again tonight. The morning after the night before, and the morning after that, and the one after that. The sun rises over Versailles, casting long shadows across the manicured gardens. But inside the palace, the atmosphere is thick with yesterday's news, and that news is you. You walk through the opulent corridors, the sound of your own footsteps echoing on the polished parquet floors. People bow and curtsy as you pass, their faces masks of perfect deference. But you feel their eyes on your back. You see the way they stop talking when you enter a room, and the way they resume their hushed conversations the second you leave. The silence is louder than any open insult. Welcome to the main event of the court's social season, the royal marriage problem. This is a fundamental aspect of life at Versailles. Gossip was not merely a pastime, it was a currency. It was the stock market of the court. Information, whether true, false, or somewhere in between, was power. Knowing a secret before anyone else could elevate your status. Spreading a juicy rumor could damage a rival. And right now, the juiciest rumor, the blue-chip stock of gossip, is the state of your marriage bed. It's the talk of the antechambers, the buzz in the salons, the whisper behind the fans. The courtiers have become amateur detectives, analyzing every scrap of evidence. When you and Antoinette attend mass, they watch to see if you stand too far apart. At the dinner table, they count how many times you speak to each other, usually zeros. They dissect her wardrobe. Is she choosing looser gowns to hide non-existent pregnancy, or tighter ones to prove there's nothing to hide? It's a relentless, Chief and Josh is a surveillance operation, and the verdict is spreading like wildfire. The Dauphin is impotent. Here's a bizarre and slightly pathetic detail that illustrates the king-in-waiting's predicament, frustrated and unable to deal with the mounting pressure. Louis XVI, the old king, takes it upon himself to give his grandson some man-to-man advice. But Louis XVI, a man whose entire life has been a monument to seduction and pleasure, has no idea how to talk to his timid, devout grandson. His advice, as recorded by horrified courtiers, is crude, cynical, and completely unhelpful. He essentially gives the boy a mechanical rundown, as if explaining how to prime a musket. The conversation leaves young Louis more mortified and withdrawn than ever. It's like asking a rock star to teach a monk how to party. The fundamental languages are incompatible. The whispers are not just confined to the nobility. This is a crucial point. The Palace of Versailles, for all its exclusivity, was a leaky vessel. The servants knew everything. The violets, the chambermaids, the wig makers, the cooks, they are the conduits through which the secrets of the mighty flow down to the masses. A valet tells his cousin, who works in a tavern in Paris. That cousin tells a table of patrons. Soon, the gossip of the court becomes the joke of the marketplace. The most intimate failure of the future king is being discussed over bread and wine in the city. This is where the narrative begins to sour from simple pity to outright mockery. The French have a long and storied tradition of political satire, often crude and merciless, and a sexually dysfunctional monarch is a gift to satirists. They can't openly criticize the heir to the throne for, say, being politically inept, but they can mock his manhood. It becomes a powerful metaphor. The king who cannot govern his own bed, how can he possibly govern the kingdom? His private weakness is seen as a symbol of his public weakness. And here, historians are divided on the immediate impact. Some argue that in these early years, the gossip was largely confined to the court and the Parisian elite. The vast majority of the French peasantry, they contend, were illiterate and too consumed with their own survival to care about the royal couple's bedroom antics. They needed bread, not gossip. Other historians, however, argue that this underestimates the power of oral tradition and popular imagery. They believe that jokes and rumors spread farther and faster than we think, planting the first seeds of disrespect for a monarch who hadn't even taken the throne yet. The idea of a broken king began to take root in the popular imagination long before the revolution was even a whisper. For Marie Antoinette, the situation is even more cruel. If he is seen as impotent, she is seen as either undesirable or, worse, as a failure for not being able to inspire him. The whispers about her are different. They carry as anaphobic sting. What can you expect from the Austrian, they mutter. She's cold, she's arrogant. Her failure to produce an heir is twisted into a failure of her character, her nationality, her very being. She came to France to be the mother of a king, and 700 dawns into her marriage. She is still a virgin. The title they have given her, the Dauphine, the future queen, feels like a costume she wears, but the role remains unplayed. And every morning, the sun rises on her failure. and the whispers begin anew. Faced with a nightly ordeal he cannot conquer and a court he cannot charm. You, Louis August. To what any overwhelmed introvert would do you retreat into your hobbies? You build a fortress of solitude not out of stone, but out of metal filings and gunpowder, compasses and maps. Your private workshops and libraries become your sanctuary. The only place in all of Versailles where you feel competent and in control. Let's focus on your primary passion, locksmithing. High up in the attics of the palace, you have a private forge and workshop. It's your man cave, 18th century style. Here, surrounded by anvils, files, vices, and blueprints, you are not the awkward dauphin, the failing husband. You are a craftsman, an artisan. The intricacies of a lock are comforting. A tumbler that won't turn, a key that won't fit, these are logical problems. They have solutions. You can apply reason, patience, and skill, and eventually, the mechanism will yield, the lock will tick open. It's a satisfying, tangible victory. A world away from the messy, illogical, and utterly baffling puzzle of your marriage. This hobby is a well-known historical fact, but its interpretation is key. To your supporters, it's shown to humble, serious-minded prince, interested in mechanics and the sciences, a welcome change from the frivolity of your grandfather's court. But to your detractors, it was a source of endless mockery. The future king of France, spending his days like a common laborer, getting his hands dirty with grease and metal dust, it was seen as unkingly, bourgeois, and deeply weird. The satirical cartoons, which are starting to become a real problem, had a field day with this. They draw you as a clumsy blacksmith, fumbling with keys, unable to find the right one to unlock the royal treasure or the gates of love. The symbolism was as subtle as a sledgehammer. And then there's your other great, love hunting. This was a more traditionally royal pursuit, but you approach it with a workmanlike fervor. Not the dashing flair of your ancestors. You hunt almost every day, often for hours on end, exhausting yourself and your horses. The physical exertion is a release. Out in the forests of Campion, there are no whispering courtiers, no expectant glances from your wife. There is only the chase, the wind, and the clear, unambiguous goal of cornering your prey. Here's a fantastic, slightly obsessive little detail that reveals so much about your personality. You keep a meticulous diary, but it's not filled with your inner thoughts or feelings about the political state of your or your personal frustrations. For the most part, it's a hunting and activity log, day after day. The entries are stark and simple: hunting, stirred, took 2. Hunting, took 5. On days when you don't hunt, you sometimes just write the single word "ring." Nothing. The most famous and tragically ironic of these ring entries would come years later. On July 14, Yao Qibaju, the day the Bastille fell. Historians love to point this out as a sign of a monarch completely detached from the reality of his kingdom. He was writing nothing on a day that changed everything. But was he really that detached? This is where the historical debate comes in. Some scholars argue that the diary is proof of a dull, an imaginative mind, a man more concerned with his kill count than his country. They see the ring on the day of the Bastille's fall as the ultimate symbol of his incompetence. Others, however, offer a more charitable interpretation. They argue that the diary was never meant for public consumption. It was a private log of his main activity for the day. On July 14th, he didn't hunt. Therefore, in the narrow, specific context of his journal-keeping habit, nothing happened. They argue that we shouldn't confuse a boring diary with a boring mind. He was, in fact, a very well-read man who was deeply interested in science, exploration, and naval history. He avidly followed the voyages of Captain Cook and was a major proponent of French naval reform. But that nuanced reality doesn't matter to the gossips at Versailles. What they see is a husband who, given the choice between his beautiful young wife's company and a smelly, sweaty day chasing a deer through the mud, chooses the deer every single time. They see a man who would rather talk to a locksmith about tumbler mechanisms than make polite conversation with his own queen. His hobbies, which are his only source of comfort and self-esteem, are weaponized against him. They become further proof of his inadequacy, his strangeness, his failure as a husband and a future king. So you retreat further. You spend more time in your workshop, more time in the forest. You build your walls higher. But in doing so, you leave your wife completely alone, stranded in the center of that glittering, hushed court. She is left to face the whispers and the stares by herself, while you are off finding solace in the satisfying click of a well-made lock. The very thing you do to cope is making the overall situation infinitely worse. While you, Louis, find your escape in the solitary worlds of iron and forest. Your wife, Marie Antoinette, has no such exit. She is trapped in the full glare of the public eye, and her every action is judged against a single, brutal metric: her womb. The single most important task of a queen, particularly a foreign-born one, was to produce a male heir dauphin. It was her biological imperative, her political race on d'etre. And on this front, she was failing spectacularly, through no fault of her own. You have to understand the immense pressure this single job entailed. It wasn't just about providing a successor, it was about solidifying her own position. A queen who gave birth to a son was secure. She had fulfilled her contract. She had woven herself into the fabric of the dynasty. A barren queen, on the other hand, was precarious. She remained the Austrian, a disposable outsider. Her value was provisional, her role incomplete. Every month that passed without a pregnancy was another month she spent on probation. The reminders of her duty were constant and came from all directions. The older, high-ranking ladies of the court, the self-appointed guardians of royal tradition, would make pointed comments. They'd talk wistfully about the fecundity of past queens. They would offer unsolicited advice, thinly veiled criticisms disguised as helpful suggestions. Perhaps your highness should pray more discreet. Then, they might say, with a look that clearly implied the problem was her lack of piety, not her husband's lack of action. Then there were the public ceremonies. On certain holidays, it was traditional for the royal family to watch processions of mothers and their children. For Antoinette, these events became a form of psychological torment. She would have to stand and smile graciously, the very picture of queenly benevolence, while her own childlessness was put on public display. Each baby presented to her was a tiny, gurgling accusation. This leads to a particularly poignant telling detail: her obsession with children. She loved having them around her. She would often invite the children of the Palace of nobility to her private apartments to play. She would shower them with gifts and affection, acting as a sort of doting, surrogate aunt. She even adopted a few poor peasant children, paying for their upbringing and education. On the surface, this was seen as a sign of her tender, maternal nature, but historians see a deeper, more painful motivation. Her rooms, filled with the laughter of other people's children, were a way to fill the void, to create a facsimile of the family life she so desperately craved and was so conspicuously denied. It was a coping mechanism, but it was also a constant, painful reminder of what she didn't have. Of course, the most significant pressure came from her own mother, the Empress Maria Theresa in Vienna. The Empress was a formidable political operator who saw her daughter's marriage not in terms of happiness, but in terms of geopolitical strategy. She had sent her daughter to France for a purpose, and that purpose was not being fulfilled. The Empress maintained a constant stream of correspondence with Antoinette, and her letters were a masterclass in maternal guilt-tripping on political pressure. They were filled with instructions, reproaches, and increasingly frantic demands for news of a pregnancy. Here we come to a historical debate about the Empress's role. Was she a cruel, unfeeling mother who saw her daughter as a mere pawn? Some of her letters certainly read that way. She chastised Antoinette for being frivolous, for not trying hard enough to inspire passion in her husband, for failing in her one true duty. She wrote things like, "You are both young. I cannot repeat it enough: tenderness, caresses, patience. You would be unforgivable to fail through your own fault. The implication was clear: if the marriage was a failure, it was Antoinette's fault for not being seductive enough. However, other historians argue that Maria Theresa was also a pragmatic ruler who knew the dangers her daughter faced. An unconsummated marriage could be annulled. If that happened, Antoinette would be sent back to Austria in disgrace. A repudiated wife, her political value destroyed. The peace between France and Austria would crumble. So the Empress's nagging, well, harsh, might have stemmed from a place of genuine political fear for her daughter's future and the stability of Europe. Was it cruelty or panicked pragmatism? The letters can be read both ways. Either way, for Antoinette, reading these letters in her only apartment in Versailles must have felt like salt in a gaping wound. Her own mother, her closest confidant, was blaming her for the situation. She was failing as a wife, failing as a queen, and failing as a daughter. She was surrounded by a court that watched her with cold, critical eyes, and married to a man who barely looked at her. The one job she had been sent to do was the one job she was powerless to perform. The weight of it all was crushing. Trapped in a silent marriage in the critical court, with her official job on indefinite hold. What was a teenage queen to do? Marie Antoinette did what anyone drowning in frustration and loneliness might do. She sought escape. If she couldn't find fulfillment in the royal bedchamber or respect in the formal throne room, she would create her own world, a world where she was the undisputed center, where the currency was not airs but elegance, wit, and novelty. She threw herself headfirst into the intoxicating whirl of high fashion, extravagant parties, and high-stakes gambling. And her clothes, she abandoned the stiff, traditional court gowns for the latest, most daring creations of the fashion designer Rose Bertin, who became a close confidant and was dubbed the Minister of Fashion. The expense was astronomical, while the country was groaning under debt. The Queen's fashion budget became a symbol of her detachment and extravagance. The whispers started to change. She was no longer just the Baron Austrian, she was becoming Madame Deficit. This leads us to a fascinating and weird little detail: the chemise à la reine. In a radical departure from the structured, corseted gowns of the court, Antoinette popularized a simple, loose-fitting white muslin dress, tied with a sash. It looked, to her critics, like underwear. When a portrait of her wearing this dress was displayed at the Salon of 1783, it caused a public scandal. The public was outraged. How dare the Queen of France be painted in her slip? It was seen as indecent. An affront to the dignity of the crown. What she saw as a comfortable, pastoral fashion statement, a breath of fresh air, the public saw as yet another sign of her inappropriate, foreign, and morally loose character. Alongside fashion, she dove into the Parisian nightlife. She owned a small circle of young, glamorous friends. Her société particularly, he would slip out of Versailles and head to masked balls in the city. They gambled, they danced, they stayed up until dawn. For Antoinette, this was freedom. It was a chance to be anonymous, to shed the crushing weight of her royal identity for a few hours. It was a way to feel young and alive. But for the public and the old guarded court, it was a scandal. The Queen of France, running around Paris incognito, gambling away fortunes at the card table. The rumors began to take on a more sinister, sexualized turn. What else was she doing on these late-night excursions? And this is where a historical debate still rages. Was Antoinette a clueless heir? A let-them-eat-cake caricature who partied while her kingdom crumbled? This has been the popular narrative for centuries, immortalized in countless books and films. It's the image of a woman who was simply too shallow and self-absorbed to understand her role. However, many modern historians and biographers offer a more sympathetic and complex view. They argue that she was a young, isolated woman acting out of desperation. Her husband was emotionally absent. The court was hostile. Her one job was impossible. Her frivolity was a predictable response to an intolerable situation. They argue that she was creating a support system, a chosen family of friends who offered her the fun and affection she couldn't find anywhere else. Were her choices politically disastrous? Absolutely. but were they humanly understandable perhaps? She was, after all, still a teenager, trying to navigate an impossible life. She wasn't trying to bankrupt France, she was trying to survive her own loneliness. But intention doesn't matter when it comes to public perception. Every glittering party, every diamond necklace, every towering hairstyle was another brick in the wall separating her from the French people. She was building her own world to escape her gilded cage. But in doing so, she was unknowingly helping her enemies build the case against her. One silk ribbon and one gambling debt at a time. The escape was just another trap. While Marie Antoinette was building a reputation for frivolity inside the palace walls, a far uglier and more dangerous narrative was taking shape outside of them. In the grimy print shops and back alley bookstores of Paris, a new industry was booming, the production of libelles. These were illegal, anonymously written pamphlets, and they were the 18th century equivalent of viral hate posts. They were cheap, nasty, and utterly devastating, and their favorite targets were you, the royal couple. This is the central, unavoidable historical fact of this era. The libelles were a key factor in the desacralization of the monarchy. For centuries, the King of France was seen as God's chosen representative on earth, his body sacred, his authority absolute. The libelles took a sledgehammer to that sacred image. They weren't political treatises arguing about tax policy, they were deeply personal, pornographic attacks that dragged the monarchy not just off its pedestal, but through the deepest, filthiest gutter. The pamphlets targeting you, Louis, were relentless in their mockery. They built upon the court gossip of your impotence and magnified it into a national joke. You were depicted as a weak, cuckolded fool, a chubby, bumbling idiot who preferred playing with keys to pleasuring his wife. The locksmith hobby was a gift to the cartoonists. They drew you as the royal locksmith, unable to open the one lock that truly mattered. They called you a dull-witted Vulcan, the lame, deformed god of the forge from Roman mythology, married to the beautiful but unfaithful Venus. But the attacks on Marie Antoinette were infinitely more vicious. This is where the pamphlets moved from political satire to pure, unadulterated character assassination, fueled by a potent cocktail of misogyny and xenophobia. They called her L'Autrichine, the Austrian, spitting the word out like a curse. The nickname cleverly rhymed with chine, the French word for a female dog, which was no accident. She was portrayed as a voracious, insatiable foreigner, a sexual predator whose appetites could not be satisfied by her feeble husband. And this is where we have to talk about the content. Without being gratuitous, the libelles accused her of everything. They depicted her in lurid, pornographic cartoons having affairs with a revolving door of partners, her close male friends, like the handsome Swedish Count Axel von Fersen, were cast as her lovers. But it didn't stop there. They also accused her of orgies, of lesbian affairs with her friends like the Princesse de Lombardy and the Duchesse de Polignac, and even, in the most violent, damaging accusations, of incest with her own son after he was finally born. There was no lie to grotesque, no slander to depraved. Here's a bizarre and revealing tidbit about this underground industry. Who was writing this stuff? You might imagine them as proto-revolutionaries, fiery idealists trying to expose the corruption of the crown. But the reality, as historians have uncovered, is much seedier. Many of the libel lists were essentially literary mercenaries. They were failed poets, disgraced journalists, and cynical hacks living in exile in London or Amsterdam, churning out filth for cash. They were the original content trolls. Some of them even engaged in blackmail, writing a particularly vile pamphlet and then offering to sell the entire print run to the French crown for a hefty price to keep it off the market. The French government actually spent a fortune trying to suppress these pamphlets, which, of course, only made them seem more credible and desirable to the public. This leads to a point of historical debate. How much did the average French person actually believe this stuff? Some historians argue that most people didn't take the libelles literally. They knew it was exaggerated, pornographic nonsense. They consumed it as entertainment, like a scandalous tabloid, It was a way to express their growing dissatisfaction with the regime in a coded, symbolic way. The Queen's imaginary orgies were a stand-in for the monarchy's real financial excesses. However, a growing number of historians argue that this view is just simplistic. They contend that even if people didn't believe every lurid detail, the sheer volume and relentless consistency of the attacks had a corrosive effect. The old saying, "There's no smoke without fire," applies. The pamphlets might be lies, but maybe the Queen is promiscuous. The King might not be a total idiot, but maybe he is weak. Over time, the constant barrage of slander eroded any benefit of the doubt the public might have had. The libel less permanently stained the royal couple's reputation, creating a caricature that, for many, would become more real than the people themselves. So while you are struggling with your private demons inside the palace, this public image is being forged in the cesspit of Paris. You are becoming fictional characters in a nationwide drama of hate, and the tragedy is, you are almost completely powerless to stop it. Your failure in the bedroom has provided the seed of a story, and now, in the hands of these anonymous authors, it has grown into a monstrous, twisted tree whose poisonous fruits are spreading across the entire kingdom. While the pamphleteers were prescribing a diet of slander and mockery to the public, the royal court was desperately seeking its own remedies for the king's delicate situation. The unconsummated marriage was no longer a secret. It was a slow-burning crisis. And in the pre-scientific world of the 18th century, a medical problem of this nature attracted a parade of doctors, quacks, and well-intentioned advisors, each armed with their own bizarre theories and even more bizarre cures. You, Lewis, become the unwilling patient in a series of mortifying consultations. The finest physicians in the kingdom are called in. They are men of science, for their time, but their understanding of the intricate links between psychology and physiology is rudimentary at best. They poke, they prod. They ask deeply personal and humiliating questions in front of a rotating cast of concerned ministers and ancient courtiers. Your most private moments become the subject of a clinical, public post-mortem. This is the historical reality of 18th century medicine. It was a wild mix of genuine observation, ancient superstition, and pure guesswork. The prevailing medical theory of the time was still heavily influenced by the idea of the four humours: blood, sperm, yellow bile, and black bile. Ailments were seen as an imbalance of these fluids. So the first wave of advice you receive is all about rebalancing your royal humours to promote vigour and vitality. The prescriptions are a gastronomic nightmare. You are advised to eat mountains of beef and drink hearty burgundy wine to thicken the blood. A popular remedy for what they called male frigidity was a rich, restorative broth. But this wasn't just any chicken soup. The recipes were specific and slightly horrifying. One popular concoction involved boiling down multiple roosters, symbols of virility, along with exotic spices, herbs, and sometimes even pearls, which were believed to have strengthening properties. You are essentially forced to drink rooster essence, day after day, in the desperate hope that it will spark some inner fire. It doesn't. It just gives you indigestion. When diet fails, they move on to external applications. Here's a wonderfully weird and cringe-worthy example of the cures being floated at court. One popular theory was that the king's vital heat was low. To remedy this, advisors suggested applying warming plasters on ointments made from ingredients like crushed mustard seeds, nettles, and even, according to some racier accounts, the infamous Spanish fly powder made from crushed blister beetles, which was a notoriously dangerous and unpredictable irritant. The idea that a poultice of beetle juice could solve a problem of dynastic succession seems absurd to us, but it was considered cutting-edge medical advice at the time. And it wasn't just the doctors. Everyone has an opinion. Old aristocrats, who fancy themselves experts in the amorous arts, pull you aside to offer their own worldly wisdom, usually involving embarrassing anecdotes and completely useless steps. Visiting dignitaries from foreign courts bring their own folk remedies. The Spanish ambassador might swear by a diet of raw onions and celery. An Italian duke might suggest cold baths to shock the system into action. It's an endless barrage of unsolicited, terrible advice. This brings us to a historical debate that still echoes in biographies of you and Antoinette. How much of this was taken seriously did you, a well-read man of the Enlightenment, actually believe that rooster soup or weird double rub was going to work? Some historians paint you as a passive, almost helpless victim in this process, meekly submitting to whatever the doctors prescribe, no matter how humiliating. They see it as another example of your indecisiveness and inability to take control of your own life. Other historians, however, suggest that you were more skeptical than you let on. You were a man who believed in logic and mechanics. It's likely you saw these remedies for the superstitious nonsense they were. But what could you do to refuse the treatment would be seen as an admission of defeat, or worse, as a sign that you weren't even trying. So you play along. You drank the soup. You endure the consultations. You listen to the terrible advice. It's a performance. Another one in a long line of performances. All designed to show the court that you are taking the problem seriously. You are doing something, even if that something is patently ridiculous. Meanwhile, poor Marie Antoinette is given her own set of instructions. Her cures are focused on making her more alluring. She is advised to take long, relaxing baths scented with milk and herbs. Her doctors prescribe a diet meant to enhance her fertility, things like artichokes and asparagus. She is told by her mother's letters and the court gossips to be more seductive, to use her feminine wiles. Imagine the frustration. She is a beautiful young woman, married to a man who won't touch her, being told by everyone that the solution is for her to try harder, to be prettier, to be more appealing. The entire ordeal is a masterclass in blaming the victim. So the years begin to tick by, measured out in cups of disgusting broth and humiliating medical exams. The problem remains unsolved. The bizarre prescriptions have failed. The kingdom is still waiting, and the whispers are growing louder, suggesting that perhaps the issue isn't something a simple change in diet can fix. Perhaps the problem is deeper, more fundamental, and requires a far more direct and terrifying intervention. Far away in Vienna, in the Grand Hofburg Palace, an old woman is losing her patience, Empress Maria Theresa, the formidable matriarch of the Habsburg dynasty and your mother-in-law, is monitoring the situation in France with growing alarm. She is a ruler who bore 16 children, secured a vast empire, and understood power like few others. To her, this ongoing marital farce is not just a family embarrassment, it is a grave political liability. Her primary channel of information and influence is her daughter, Marie Antoinette, and the main tool she wields is her pen. The correspondence between mother and daughter from this period is one of the most remarkable and revealing royal archives in history. This washed a warm, fuzzy exchange of motherly affection. It was a relentless campaign of long-distance micromanagement, a barrage of instructions, interrogations, and recriminations that landed on Antoinette's desk with crushing regularity. This is the key historical point: these letters were not private. Maria Theresa knew, and intended, for them to be read by others. They were semi-official documents. She would give her daughter instructions, knowing full well that Antoinette would then show the letters to you, Louis, as a way of transmitting the Empress's will. It was a form of diplomatic signaling disguised as maternal advice. The letters were her way of reaching into the French court and trying to steer the ship from hundreds of miles away. The content of these letters is a brutal look into the pressures Antoinette faced. The Empress's own shifts from initial encouragement to barely concealed exasperation, and finally to outright anger. "I am becoming truly anxious," she writes. "This consummation, so long desired, has not yet happened." She scrutinizes every detail of her daughter's life. Is she dressing attractively enough? Is she being sufficiently charming and affectionate towards her husband? Is she reading the serious books her mother sends? Or is she wasting her time on frivolous novels and fashion? The advice she gives is a fascinating mix of shrewd political insight and wildly outdated gender politics. She constantly tells Antoinette to be submissive, gentle, and eager to please. The only way is through gentleness, patience, and caresses. She insists, time and time again. You must be all compliance to him. She is essentially instructing her daughter to perform a very specific kind of femininity, one designed to soothe and entice a reluctant husband. Here's a small, telling detail that reveals the Empress's frustration. She had spies in the French court, most notably the Austrian ambassador, Comte de Mercy Argenteau, who sent her regular, detailed reports on the couple's life. He was her eyes and ears, so when Antoinette would write a cheerful letter pretending everything was fine, Maria Theresa would write back with a scathing rebuttal, armed with Mercy's intel. Mercy tells me you and the king barely spoke at dinner. He says you spent the evening gambling while the king sat alone. Do not lie to me. I know everything. For Antoinette, it must have felt like there was no escape. She was being monitored by her mother from across the continent. This is where a significant historical debate arises concerning Maria Theresa's motivations. Was she a monster, a cold, calculating puppet master who treated her own daughter as a political tool? The evidence for this is strong. She explicitly states in her letters that Antoinette's happiness is secondary to the needs of the state and the Franco-Austrian alliance. She writes, "You are where Providence has placed you. You must submit to your fate and work for the good of the state you are in." It's a harsh, unsentimental view. However, other historians argue for a more nuanced perspective. They point out that Maria Theresa was a product of her time, a monarch who had survived decades of brutal European power politics. She knew that a repudiated queen was a ruined woman. She knew that a failed alliance could mean war, costing thousands of lives. In her mind, the fate of nations rested on this marriage. Her nagging, her spying, her relentless pressure, it all came from a place of high stakes, ruthless pragmatism. She wasn't just trying to get a grandchild, she was trying to hold her world together. For you, Louis, these letters, which Antoinette dutifully shows you, are another source of pressure. Now it's not just your own court and your grandfather watching you, it's the most powerful woman in Europe. The formidable Austrian Empress is essentially sending you performance reviews via your wife. It's emasculating and deeply uncomfortable. For Antoinette, it's a trap. She is caught between a husband who won't touch her, a court that despises her, and a mother who blames her. The letters from Vienna, instead of being a source of comfort from home, become missives of failure. They reinforce her deepest insecurities. She is not pretty enough, not charming enough, not clever enough. She is failing. And with every ship that arrives carrying another thick envelope sealed with the Habsburg crest, the weight on her young shoulders gets a little heavier. The silence in her bedroom is now being amplified by the angry scratching of her mother's quill pen, a sound she can probably hear in her nightmares. The years are dragging on. We are now well past the point of blaming teenage awkwardness or nerves. The rooster soup has been drunk, the weird ointments have been applied, and the nagging letters from Vienna have been read and reread. Nothing has worked. The problem, everyone is starting to realize, might be more than just a passing mood or a lack of effort. The question shifts from why won't he to why can't he, and this is where the mystery deepens, giving rise to one of the most enduring medical debates in French history. Was the king's problem a matter of psychology or physiology? On one side of the argument, you have the psychological block theory. Proponents of this view argue that the root of the issue was entirely in your mind. Louis. They point to your personality, your shyness, your social anxiety, your deep-seated religious piety, and your almost pathological aversion to your grandfather's legacy of libertinism. In this interpretation, you weren't physically incapable, you were psychologically paralyzed. The act itself had become so freighted with expectation, so tied to public duty and political consequence, that it was impossible for you to approach it as a natural, intimate act. Every time you entered the bedroom, you weren't entering as a husband, but as the Delphine of France, with the ghosts of your ancestors and the eyes of Europe watching you. The pressure created a mental wall that you simply could not overcome. This theory is compelling because it fits so well with everything we know about your character. It also explains the inconsistency. There were rumors of occasional fumbling and unsuccessful attempts. This suggests that the basic machinery was there, but the will, or the ability to relax and let nature take its course, was absent. It was the ultimate, most tragic case of performance anxiety. On the other side of the debate is the physiological defect theory. This is where things get very clinical and very personal. This theory posits that you were suffering from a specific, and actually quite common, medical condition, the most likely candidate, which has been proposed by numerous historians and biographers, is a condition called phimosis. Now, let's be delicate here. Phimosis is a condition where the foreskin is too tight to be retracted. It can make physical intimacy extremely uncomfortable, painful, and in some cases, nearly impossible. It is a purely mechanical problem, and it is correctable with a very minor surgical procedure, circumcision, or a similar small incision. This theory is tantalizing because it offers a single, simple, mechanical explanation for years of failure. You weren't weak or scared or psychologically broken, you just had a physical issue that needed a quick snip. This is where we get a weird, but crucial, detail. The court physicians absolutely knew about this condition. It was a medical mystery. So why wasn't it addressed immediately? The answer is a mix of medical risk and royal pride. In the 18th century, any surgery, even a minor one, was a life-threatening proposition. There was no anesthesia, save for a bottle of brandy and a leather strap to bite down on. There was no understanding of germs or sterilization. The risk of infection, gangrene, and death was very real. Was the potential reward and heir worth the risk of killing the future king on the operating table over a minor issue for years? The answer was a terrified no. Furthermore, imagine the humiliation for the future king of France, the most Christian king. To have to undergo a procedure on his most private parts would have been an admission of a fundamental, almost symbolic, flaw. It was one thing to be rumored impotent, it was another thing to have it confirmed by a surgeon's knife. The blow to your ego, and to the mystique of the monarchy, would have been immense. And this is where the academic debate still lives. Team psychology argues that the phimosis theory is a convenient, posthumous diagnosis that lets Lewis off the hook. They argue there's no definitive contemporary medical record that confirms the diagnosis, and that his known personality is a much more powerful and sufficient explanation for his behavior. They believe the problem was in his head. Team physiology fires back that the psychological explanation is too complex. Why suffer for 7 years over a mental block when a simple procedure could fix it? They argue that the very existence of the condition would have created the psychological block. The fear of pain and failure would have been enough to cause the anxiety and avoidance everyone observed. In this view, the physical and the psychological weren't two competing theories, they were intertwined, creating a vicious cycle of fear, pain, and failure. So what was it, a mind frozen by pressure? Or a body in need of a tiny fix, a crisis of confidence? Or a crisis of anatomy? The historical record is tantalizingly vague, leaving room for both interpretations. For 7 years, the entire French court, the Empress of Austria, and to some extent, the whole of Europe, were held hostage by this very question. The fate of a dynasty hung on a mystery located in the most intimate and inaccessible part of the king's life. The answer, when it finally came, would be less of a dramatic revelation and more of a quiet, almost anticlimactic resolution. So we stand at the crossroads of this great historical mystery. Was it performance anxiety or a physical problem? Let's take a moment to really unpack these two competing ideas. Because understanding this is key to understanding the entire 7-year saga. It's the engine of the whole drama. First, let's build a stronger case for team performance anxiety. Imagine yourself in Lewis's shoes again. But this time, let's really feel the pressure. From the moment you were born, you were not a person, you were a placeholder. You are the spare until your older brother dies, and then you become the heir. Your entire life is a set of expectations. You are expected to be majestic like your great-great-great-grandfather, Louis XIV. You are expected to be charming like your current grandfather. No sexy. You fail on both counts. You are quiet, bookish, and awkward. You know you are a disappointment in the public-facing aspects of your role. Now, add to that the wedding. You are 15. You are being married to a girl you've never met. This marriage is not a private union, it's a major international treaty. And the treaty is not sealed with a signature, but with your sexual performance. The entire court, your family, and a rival empire are literally waiting for a report from your bedroom. This is not a context for romance. It's a high-stakes final exam for which you feel you have not studied. Your wife, Marie Antoinette, is beautiful, confident, and outgoing, all the things you are not. Her very presence can feel like a judgment. Your failure to act, on the first night, creates a narrative. The king has failed. The next night, you're not just trying to connect with your wife, you're trying to disprove the narrative. The pressure doubles. This creates a feedback loop from hell. The more you fail, the more you are expected to fail, and the more you are afraid of failing, which, in turn, guarantees that you will fail. It's a self-fulfilling prophecy of impotence. Your bed, the one place that should be a sanctuary, becomes a place of judgment and dread. This psychological explanation is powerful because it requires no physical evidence. It's entirely consistent with the man we see in the historical records. Now let's argue for team anatomy, the phimosis theory. This argument is simpler, more direct, and in some ways, more tragic. The problem isn't in your head, it's a simple matter of plumbing. Intimacy for you isn't just fraught with pressure, it's physically painful. Every attempt, or even the thought of an attempt, is associated not with pleasure, but with sharp, winching discomfort. This theory has a major piece of circumstantial evidence in its favor: 7 years. 7 years is a very long time for a purely psychological issue to go unresolved in an otherwise healthy young man, especially with the entire state apparatus trying to fix it. A mental block can be overcome, but a persistent physical barrier is a much more stubborn obstacle. It also explains your avoidance. If you associate the act with pain, you will naturally avoid it. Your retreat to the forge in the forest isn't just an escape from the pressure, it's an escape from predictable physical pain. Here's a quirky detail that adds a layer to this. Medical knowledge at the time was compartmentalized and often contradictory. While physicians knew about the condition, the understanding of how it could impact a man's vigor or desire was murky. They might have seen the physical issue but misdiagnosed its psychological fallout. They might have thought, well, it's a bit tight, but it shouldn't stop a healthy young man if he's virile enough. They could have been treating the symptom lack of consummation with rooster soup, while completely missing the root mechanical cause. This is where the debate among historians gets really interesting, because it's about how we interpret a lack of evidence. Team psychology points to the fact that there is no single, unambiguous document from a doctor at the time that says, the dolphin has phimosis. It's all based on later accounts, rumors, and interpretations. They say you can't make a diagnosis based on hearsay. Team anatomy counters that. Of course, there's no document who would dare write down, in an official record, that the future King of France was physically defective in his private parts. It would have been an act of political and professional suicide. The absence of evidence, they argue, is not evidence of absence. In a court obsessed with image and mystique, a problem like this would have been shrouded in the deepest secrecy and spoken of only in the most coded whispers. So you're left with two paths. Path A, a psychologically tortured young man, crushed by the weight of his crown, unable to perform the most basic of human acts. Path B, a physically afflicted young man, whose suffering is compounded by medical ignorance and royal pride, leading to the same outcome. Or perhaps the truth, as it so often is, lies somewhere in the middle. Perhaps it started with a physical issue, a discomfort, a pain that created an initial hesitation. That hesitation was then interpreted as failure by the court. That sense of failure then created the crippling psychological anxiety, which magnified the original physical problem. The physical and the psychological were not separate issues, they were two serpents swallowing each other's tails, creating a perfect, inescapable circle of misery that lasted for 555 nights. The why is a mystery that might never be solved, but the what was clear to everyone: the royal bed was empty, and the throne of France had no heir. As the years of her quasi-marriage stretched on, Marie Antoinette grew increasingly suffocated by the rigid formality and constant scrutiny of the main palace. She needed an escape, not just a late-night trip to a masked ball in Paris, but a real, physical place she could call her own, a world away from the judging eyes of the court. She found it in a corner of the Versailles Park, the Petit Trianon. The Petit Trianon was a small, exquisite chateau on the grounds of Versailles, originally built by Louis XVI for his mistress, Madame de Pompadour, in 1774, soon after he ascended the throne. You, Louis XVI gave it to your wife as a gift. It was a gesture of kindness, perhaps even an apology for your other marital failings. You reportedly told her, "You love flowers, so I have a bouquet to offer you." The Petit Trianon. It was the first and only piece of property she would ever own outright. It became her sanctuary, her passion project, and ultimately, another source of public relations disaster. This is the key historical context. The Petit Trianon was Antoinette's attempt to create a private life in a world that allowed for none. At the main chateau, she was the Queen of France, her every move dictated by etiquette. But at the Trianon, she was just Antoinette. She decreed that even the king could not enter without her express invitation. This was a radical break from tradition. She surrounded herself with her small, exclusive circle of friends, her société particulière, and together they created a fantasy world of rustic simplicity and intimate gatherings. She redesigned the gardens in the fashionable New English style, with winding paths, romantic grottos, and a temple of love. But the most famous and controversial addition was the Hameau de Lorraine, the Queen's Hamlet. This was a fully functional, albeit highly idealized, model farm and village built around an artificial lake. It had a watermill, a dairy, a boudoir, a farmhouse, and barns. It was a picture-perfect, storybook version of peasant life. Here's the weird and wonderful detail: this wasn't just a set piece. The hamlet had real cows, which were perfumed and wore ribbons, real sheep, and a real farmer and his family to manage it all. Antoinette and her ladies-in-waiting would dress up as shepherdesses and milk maids in specially designed costumes of fine silk and muslin. They would churn butter in pristine Sevres porcelain buckets and collect eggs from immaculate chicken coops. It was cosplay, but on an epic, royal scale. For her, it was a harmless fantasy, a way to connect with a romanticized idea of nature and simplicity, a stark contrast to the gilded artifice of the court. But you can already see the problem. Can't you? While the queen is playing milkmaid in a fantasy village, actual French peasants are struggling with failed crops, crippling taxes, and genuine starvation. The news of her hamlet spread, and it was interpreted in the worst possible way. The public didn't see it as a charming escape, they saw it as a grotesque mockery of their own suffering. It was seen as the ultimate symbol of a queen so detached from reality that she had to build a toy farm to amuse herself, treating poverty as a picturesque hobby. The story of the porcelain milk pails became a potent symbol of her clueless extravagance. This is where the historical debate kicks in. Was the Hameau a unique and scandalous indulgence? Not entirely. The Back to Nature movement, inspired by philosophers like Jean-Jacques Rousseau, was all the rage among the European aristocracy. Building romantic, rustic follies on your estate was a fashionable trend. From this perspective, Antoinette wasn't doing anything particularly unusual for a woman of her class and time. She was just participating in a popular aristocratic fad. However, other historians argue that her status as queen made her situation unique. What an ordinary duchess could get away with, the Queen of France could not. Her every action had symbolic weight. At a time of growing social and economic unrest, creating a private, exclusive club and building an expensive fantasy village was politically deft. It fed directly into the narrative the libelists were already pushing, that she was a frivolous, out-of-touch foreigner who cared more for her own amusement than for the well-being of the French people. Her desire for privacy backfired spectacularly. The more she tried to close the doors of the Trianon to the wider court, the more resentful the excluded courtiers became. The nobility, who felt it was their right to be in the constant presence of the monarch, were deeply offended by being shut out. What was going on behind those closed gates? Their imaginations, fueled by jealousy, ran wild. The rumors started to fly. They whispered that the Trianon was a den of debauchery, that the Queen and her favorites were engaged in scandalous orgies, that vast sums of public money were being spent on decadent parties. The sanctuary she built to escape the gossip of Versailles became a factory for even more vicious gossip. You, Lois, largely let her be. You visited occasionally, but you respected her rules. Perhaps you were glad she had found a distraction that kept the focus off of you. But in granting her this bouquet, you had inadvertently given her the means to further isolate herself from the court and the people, and to build a beautiful, pastoral stage for her own future downfall. The perfumed cows of the Hameau would become another ghostly accusation when the real revolution came. Just when it seemed the royal marriage had settled into a permanent state of awkward, childless limbo, an unexpected figure arrives in Paris to shake things up. In April of 1777, 7 years into the marriage, a carriage clatters into the courtyard of Versailles. Out steps a man who is, by all accounts, one of the most peculiar and fascinating rulers in Europe. Joseph II, Holy Roman Emperor, ruler of the Habsburg lands, and, most importantly, Marie Antoinette's older brother. His visit was not a casual family drop-in. It was a mission. His mother, the ever-impatient Empress Maria Theresa, had essentially dispatched him to Paris to act as a one-man intervention. His goal was simple and audacious: to figure out what on earth was wrong with his sister and brother-in-law, and to fix it. He was part royal diplomat, part amateur marriage counselor. To understand the impact of his visit, you have to understand Joseph himself. He was a classic enlightened despot, a whirlwind of intellectual energy and reforming zeal. He was sharp, cynical, incredibly arrogant, and possessed a work ethic that put everyone around him to shame. He was also famously, almost comically, blunt. He had no time for the flowery, indirect language of French diplomacy or the stifling etiquette of Versailles, which he viewed with open contempt. He was a man who preferred dissecting a problem to offering polite condolences. His official title was Emperor, but he traveled incognito under the pseudonym Count von Falkenstein, fooling absolutely no one. This was a classic Joseph move, a performance of humility that was actually an assertion of his own superiority over petty royal protocol. He refused the lavish apartments prepared for him at the palace, opting for a modest hotel in Paris to show he was a man of the people. His first observations of the French court confirmed all his worst fears. He saw you, Louis, as a decent but weak and apathetic man. He wrote to their mother that Louis was a little weak, but not an imbecile. He has ideas. He has judgment, but an apathy of body as of mind. He was shocked by your obsession with hunting and locksmithing, seeing them as childish distractions from the serious business of ruling. He was equally, if not more, critical of his own sister. This brings us to a wonderfully revealing little detail about their relationship. Joseph, who was unhappily married himself to a woman he considered plain and dull, had a complicated view of women. He loved his sister, but he was also deeply critical of her lifestyle. He saw her flight into fashion, parties, and the petty Trianon not as a cry for help, but as a dereliction of duty. He followed her around for 6 weeks, acting as her shadow, and his judgment was harsh. He attended her frantic social events, watching her gamble away money at the card table until all hours. He scolded her mercilessly for her frivolity, her choice of shallow friends, and her failure to cultivate a more serious public image. "You are acting like a child," he bluntly told her. He warned her that her pursuit of pleasure was alienating the public and would lead to disaster. The revolution will be cruel, he prophetically warned, though even he couldn't have known how cruel. This is where historical opinion on Joseph's visit is divided. Was he a savior or just an arrogant meddler? Some historians see him as the only person who could have broken the deadlock. His blunt, no-nonsense approach was like a blast of cold, fresh air in the stuffy, intrigue-filled halls of Versailles. He was an outsider who could speak truths that no French courtier would dare to utter. He was there to solve a problem. And he didn't care whose feelings he hurt in the process. Other historians, however, see him as a classic know-it-all elder brother. They argue that his criticisms of Antoinette, while perhaps valid, were delivered with a coldness and superiority that left her feeling more isolated than ever. He diagnosed her loneliness and then berated her for her coping mechanisms. He offered no real emotional support, only a long list of her failings. His visit was less of a rescue and more of a 6-week performance review from a boss who already thinks you're incompetent. But Joseph didn't just observe and criticize. He was a man of action. He understood that scolding his sister was only half the battle. The real problem lay with her husband. He spent hours with you, Louis. They went on long walks. They inspected your workshops. They talked. The entire court watched these two mismatched brothers-in-law. The energetic, cynical emperor in the shy, hesitant king, wondering what was being said. And then, Joseph did what no one else had dared to do. He sat you down for a frank, man-to-man conversation about the one topic everyone else only whispered about: your sex life. The fate of the dynasty was about to hinge on one of the most awkward brother-in-law talks in history. The climax of Emperor Joseph I's interventionist tour was not a grand state dinner or a formal treaty signing. It was a private conversation. A talk between two brothers-in-law, held away from the prying ears of the court. What exactly was said in that room remains one of history's tantalizing little mysteries, as neither you nor Joseph ever recorded the specifics. But we can piece together the substance of it from the dramatic results that followed, and from the letters Joseph wrote to his other brother, Leopold, in which he was remarkably, almost clinically, candid. Imagine the scene. You, Lois, shy and reserved, are sitting across from this force of nature. Your brash, worldly, and intimidatingly intelligent brother-in-law, Joseph, with his characteristic lack of ceremony, gets straight to the point. He doesn't bother with euphemisms or courtly niceties. He essentially asks you, point blank, what is going on in the bedroom. This is the central event that changes everything. For 7 years, no one had been able to have this conversation with you. Your grandfather, Louis XVI, had tried and failed, offering only crude, unhelpful advice. Your doctors had medicalized the issue into a series of humiliating examinations and bizarre prescriptions. But Joseph approached it as a practical problem between two men. Based on his letters, we know that Joseph came to a startlingly simple conclusion. He wrote to Leopold that you, Louis, were a perfectly healthy and capable man. The core of the problem, he diagnosed, was a combination of sluggishness and sheer ignorance. In his own words, he described you both as two complete blunderers. He believed you simply didn't know what you were doing. He wrote, with almost comical exasperation, that you have strong, well-conditioned erections but that you just stick it in for a minute or two, withdraw without completing the act, and then bid your wife good night. It was, in his view, a problem of technique. And here is where we get the most famous and slightly bizarre detail of the entire affair. Joseph I, the Holy Roman Emperor, apparently gave the King of France a sex-ed lesson. He explained the basic mechanics of intercourse, likely in a very direct, no-nonsense, almost scientific way. He would have treated it like explaining the function of a new piece of artillery. He would have told you to be more patient, to be more considerate of your wife, and to, for lack of a better phrase, see the job through to its conclusion. He advised you to plow your furrow. It's an agricultural metaphor that is both deeply unromantic and perfectly in character for the pragmatic emperor. But his advice wasn't just mechanical. He also played the role of a marriage counselor. He talked to you about his sister. He explained her loneliness, her frustration, her need for affection. He likely tried to bridge the cavernous emotional gap between you and Antoinette, encouraging you to see her not as a terrifying foreign princess or a dynastic requirement, but as a young, lonely woman who needed a friend and a husband. He tried to get you to talk to her, to spend more time with her, to treat her as a partner. This is where the historical debate about Joseph's impact centers. Was it really just a matter of a simple birds and the bees talk? Could 7 years of failure truly be chalked up to a lack of basic information? Some historians are skeptical. They argue that it seems too simplistic, almost insulting to your intelligence, to suggest you were that naive. They believe that Joseph's talk was more about breaking a psychological barrier than providing a technical manual. His blunt, authoritative, and non-judgmental approach may have given you the permission and confidence you needed. He demystified the act, stripping it of its terrifying political weight and reducing it to a normal, manageable human function. He was like a coach giving a nervous athlete a simple, clear instruction that cuts through the fog of anxiety. Other historians, however, take Joseph's assessment more literally. They argue that in an age of segregated upbringing and a complete lack of formal sex education, especially for a devout and sheltered boy like you, it is entirely plausible that you were simply, as Joseph put it, the blunderer. You knew the goal, but you weren't sure of the process. Joseph's frank advice, they contend, was the key that finally unlocked the puzzle. Whatever the exact phrasing, the conversation worked. Something shifted in you. Joseph left Paris shortly after, his mission apparently complete. He had diagnosed the problem, berated his sister into a more sober lifestyle, and given his brother-in-law a much-needed push. In a final letter, he summarized his findings with his typical arrogance. My sister has her faults, but she has a good heart. Her husband is a little weak, but not at all. If I have been of some use to them, I shall have no cause to regret my journey. He had planted a seed of change, but there was still one more lingering question, one more piece of the puzzle that needed to fall into place. The conversation had addressed the how, but there was still the shadow of that other possibility, the physical impediment. The emperor's talk may have cleared the psychological path, but what if there was still a real, physical gate blocking the way? Emperor Joseph's pep talk was a major turning point, a psychological breakthrough that cleared away years of anxiety and misinformation. But the story doesn't end there. There is one final, shadowy chapter to this medical saga, the persistent and compelling rumor of a secret surgery. While the two blunderers theory explained the lack of technique, it didn't fully satisfy everyone, especially those who still believed in a physical cause. This is where the historical narrative gets murky, relying on whispers, anecdotal evidence, and a great deal of speculation. The theory goes like this: sometime after Joseph's visit, you, Louis, finally consented to a minor surgical procedure to correct the suspected phimosis. The operation would have been a post-heatomai, a simple incision to loosen the foreskin, or perhaps even a full circumcision. It was the definitive, physical fix to the problem that had plagued you for 7 long years. This is the central historical claim we need to examine. The problem is, there is no official record of this surgery. You will not find an entry in the royal physician's log that says, "Today, performed a small operation on the king's private parts." As we've discussed, such a record would have been unthinkable. The procedure, if it happened, would have been one of the most closely guarded state secrets in France. It would have been performed discreetly, perhaps at night, with only a tiny, trusted team presenter surgeon, your head physician, and maybe 1 or 2 loyal valets sworn to absolute secrecy. So where does the evidence for this secret surgery come from? It comes primarily from second-hand sources and later memoirs. Foreign ambassadors, writing home to their own courts, mentioned rumors circulating in Paris that the king had finally been cured by a surgeon's knife. Members of the extended royal family wrote about it in their diaries years later. Even one of Marie Antoinette's ladies-in-waiting, Madame de Campan, alluded to it in her influential memoirs. though she did so with characteristic discretion, framing it as a long-delayed remedy to a natural obstacle. Here's a quirky and telling detail that lends credence to the surgery theory. The man often credited with performing the procedure was your head physician, Dr. Lawson. Interestingly, Dr. Lawson was a known advocate for this specific type of minor surgery and had written about its effectiveness in medical journals. He was the right man, in the right place, at the right time. The theory suggests that Joseph I's visit provided the final push. The Emperor's frank assessment may have convinced you that the risk of a quick, modern procedure was now less than the ongoing political risk of remaining childless. Joseph may have told you, in his blunt way, to just get it over with. This is where the historical community remains sharply divided. It is perhaps the most contentious point in your entire biography. Team surgery argues that the circumstantial evidence is overwhelming. The timing is just too perfect. For 7 years, there's nothing. Then, Joseph visits, and shortly after, the marriage is consummated and Antoinette becomes pregnant. It's a classic case of post hoc ergo propter hoc after this. Therefore, because of this, they believe the surgery was the final, necessary step. The conversation with Joseph provided the psychological courage, and the surgery provided the physical means. One without the other would not have been enough. On the other side, Team No Surgery or Team Psychology is enough pushes back hard. They argue that the rumors are just that, rumors. In a court environment as gossipy as Versailles, people were desperate for a tidy, dramatic explanation for the sudden change. The story of a secret surgery was a much better story than the Emperor gave the king a pep talk. They contend that the accounts are all second-hand, written years after the fact, and likely colored by the desire to create a more compelling narrative. They stick to the two blonder us theory, arguing that Joseph's intervention alone was sufficient to break the deadlock. It was a software update, not a hardware fix. This debate matters because it fundamentally changes how we view you, Louis XVI. If the surgery happened, you become a more tragic figure, a man who suffered for 7 years from a correctable physical ailment due to a combination of fear, pride, and primitive medical standards. Your 7-year failure wasn't a weakness of character, but a treatable medical condition. If the surgery didn't happen, then you are a more complex psychological case, a man so paralyzed by anxiety and a sense of duty that he was unable to perform a basic human function until a bullying brother-in-law talked him into it. We will likely never know for sure. The truth is probably lost to time, buried under layers of courtly secrecy and historical gossip. There is no smoking gun, no surgeon's invoice, no diary entry from you saying, "Well, that was unpleasant, but I'm glad it's over." We are left with a tantalizing historical mystery. But whether it was the talk, the surgery, or a combination of both, something profound changed in the summer and autumn of 1777. The invisible wall in the royal bedroom, which had stood firm for over 500 nights, was about to come crashing down. The long wait was finally over. The autumn of 1777 gives way to the spring of 1778. The air in Versailles seems different, lighter. The oppressive cloud of anxiety that has hung over the court for 7 years has begun to dissipate. The change is subtle at first. You and Antoinette are seen talking more often, taking walks together in the gardens. There's a new ease in your interactions, a hint of genuine companionship that was never there before. The courtiers, ever the vigilant observers, notice. The whispers change their tune, from mockery to curious anticipation. Then, on a spring morning, the news breaks, spreading through the palace with the speed of a lit fuse. It's official. The queen is pregnant. After 7 years, 5 months, and countless nights of silence, the great work has been accomplished. The 7-year itch, or in your case, the 7-year awkwardness, has finally come to an end. The marriage has been consummated. The dynasty is, at long last, on its way to being secured. The collective sigh of relief from the royal court, the ministers, and the empress in Vienna is practically audible. This is the pivotal moment the entire kingdom has been waiting for. The consummation of the marriage wasn't just a private milestone for you and Antoinette, it was a major political event. It validated the Franco-Austrian alliance. It stabilized your position as king and her position as queen. It put an end to the endless, humiliating speculation. For the first time, you are seen not just as the king, but as a man. For the first time, Antoinette is seen not as a barren foreigner, but as the potential mother of France. The immediate effect on your relationship is profound. A huge, unreachable barrier between you has been removed. You are no longer actors in a failed play, but partners in a shared, successful enterprise. Sources from the time report a newfound tenderness between you. You, Lois, become doting and attentive, constantly inquiring after your wife's health and comfort. You've conquered a great personal demon, and the victory fills you with a quiet confidence that was previously unimaginable. You are finally fulfilling your most fundamental duty as king. For Antoinette, the pregnancy is a liberation. It is the ultimate vindication against all her critics. She has done her job. She can finally hold her head high. The taunts of the Austrian and the whispers about her barrenness are silenced, at least for now. Her letters to her mother take on a new tone of joy and pride. I am in the happiest state possible, she writes. She is no longer a probationary queen, she is the real thing. Let's pause for a weird, but telling, detail about royal pregnancies. In an era with no medical tests, how did they confirm a pregnancy? It was largely based on the Queen's own testimony and the cessation of her menstrual cycle. But it was also monitored by the court's senior ladies, who would observe her for physical signs like morning sickness or a growing belly. It was, like everything else in her life, a semi-public condition, and once confirmed, she became a precious national resource. Her diet, her activities, her entire life was now managed for the sole purpose of producing a healthy heir. This is where historical debate can find a small foothold, even in a moment of apparent triumph. Did the consummation of the marriage truly fix your relationship? Some romantic biographers portray this as the beginning of a genuine love story. They argue that once the physical barrier was removed, you discovered a deep and abiding affection for each other that would sustain you through the future horrors of the revolution. They point to your later loyalty and devotion to each other as proof that a true partnership was forged in this moment. However, more cynical historians offer a different take. They argue that while the consummation solved a political and dynastic problem, it didn't magically erase 7 years of distance, neglect, and public humiliation. The damage to your public reputations was already done. Furthermore, they suggest that you and Antoinette were still fundamentally mismatched people. You found common ground in your shared duty and your children, but you never truly overcame your core differences in personality. You were still the quiet homebody, and she was still the life of the party. The relationship became a functional, even affectionate, partnership, but perhaps not the great passion that some have painted it to be. It was a successful merger, not a whirlwind romance. Regardless of the inner emotional reality, the external reality was one of celebration. The news of the Queen's pregnancy was announced to the public, and Paris erupted in festivities. People cheered in the streets. There was a Te Deum service at Notre Dame to thank God. For a brief, shining moment, the years of mockery are forgotten. You are the competent king. She is the fertile queen, and all is right with the world. But one crucial question remains, hanging in the air amidst the celebration. The Queen is pregnant. Yes. But what will the child be? A girl would be a joy, a welcome first step. But only a boy, a Dauphin, could truly secure the succession and silence the last of the critics. The entire kingdom holds its breath once more, waiting for the final, most important act of this long drama, the birth. The 9 months of the Queen's pregnancy are a period of national anticipation. For Marie Antoinette, it is a time of both bliss and confinement. She is treated like a precious, fragile vessel. Her late-night parties are curtailed. Her horseback riding is forbidden, and her diet is meticulously managed. The entire court revolves around the health of the queen and her unborn child. You, Louis, are a model of solicitous concern, fussing over her comfort and spending more time with her than ever before. For the first time, you look like a normal, expectant couple. Finally, on a cold December day in 1778, the moment arrives. The queen goes into labor. And now we witness one of the most astonishingly strange and dangerous rituals of the French monarchy, the public birth. Just as your marriage was a public performance, so too is the birth of your child. The principle behind it was to prevent any accusations of a changeling or a baby being swapped at birth. The legitimacy of the heir had to be witnessed by the nation. But witnessed is an understatement. As soon as the queen's labor begins, the doors to her bedchamber are thrown open. A massive crowd of people, not just doctors and nurses, but courtiers, ministers, servants, and even curious members of the public who happen to be in the palace pours into the room. It is a chaotic, suffocating scrum. They climb on furniture to get a better view. The room becomes so packed and overheated that the air is unbreathable. This is the central, shocking historical fact of this chapter. The birth of a royal child was a public spectacle that put the queen's life in grave danger, and in this case, it nearly killed her. Contemporary accounts describe the scene as a terrifying mob. Antoinette, in agonizing labor, is surrounded by dozens, perhaps hundreds, of staring, sweating, noisy people. The pressure and the lack of oxygen become too much. After the baby is born, she suffers a seizure and faints, her life hanging by a thread. The quick-thinking doctors have to resort to bloodletting, a common, if dangerous, practice at the time to revive her. You, in a rare display of decisive fury, personally helped to smash the windows to let in fresh air and scream for the crowd to get out. It is a moment of pure chaos and terror. And in the midst of this madness, the child is born. A doctor holds up the baby. The entire room, the entire kingdom, is waiting for one of two words. It is a dauphin, or it is a madam. The announcement comes. It is a girl, a healthy, beautiful baby princess, who will be named Marie-Thérèse Charlotte. A wave of mixed emotions sweeps through the room. There is joy, of course. A royal child has been born. The queen is a mother. The succession is no longer a hypothetical, but there is also a palpable sense of anticlimax. A subtle, collective sigh of disappointment. A princess is wonderful, but she cannot inherit the throne. The primary job, producing a male heir, remains undone. Here's a small, poignant detail. In the moments after the birth, you, Louis, are overjoyed. You hold your daughter, reportedly weeping with happiness. Your paternal instincts are immediate and powerful, but you are also aware of the political reality. According to one account, you turn to your new daughter and whisper, "Poor little one, you are not what was desired, but you will be no less dear to me. A son would have belonged more to the state. You shall be my own." It's a beautiful, tender sentiment that also reveals the crushing weight of public duty that overshadowed even this most personal moment. This is where historical analysis focuses on the what next. Did the birth of a daughter solve the monarchy's image problem? Yes and no. On the one hand, it proved that the royal couple was capable of producing children. The long-standing jokes about your impotence and her barrenness were finally put to rest. The consummation was not a one-off fruit. This was a huge victory. It normalized you as a couple and as a family. On the other hand, the succession was still not secure. Under Sully's law, which had governed the French succession for centuries, a woman could not inherit the throne. The dynasty was still one heartbeat away from a succession crisis. If you were to die without a son, the crown would pass to your younger brother, the Comte de Provence, a man known for his ambition and his dislike of Marie Antoinette. So the pressure, while lessened, did not disappear. It simply reset. The clock started ticking again. Now the question was not can they have a child, but can they have a son? For Antoinette, motherhood is a profound and transformative experience. She adores her daughter, whom she nicknames Mousseline. She throws herself into being a doting, hands-on mother, a stark contrast to the distant, formal parenting style of previous generations of royals. She breastfeeds her child for a time, a practice championed by Rousseau but considered shockingly common and done queenily by the old guard at court. This newfound maternal bliss softens her public image for a time, but beneath the surface, the political imperative remains. She has proven her fertility, but she has not yet delivered the goods. The birth of Marie Therese was a crucial battle won, but the war for the throne was not yet over. The kingdom still needed a dauphin. The birth of the princess brought a new warmth and domesticity to your lives, but the political clock never stopped ticking. The court, the ministers, and the ever-anxious empress in Vienna were all waiting for round two. For the next 3 years, the cycle of hope and monthly disappointment continued. But this time, it was different. The shame and public humiliation were gone. It was now a normal marital challenge, a race against time that many couples face, just played out on a much grander stage. Then, in the autumn of 1781, the wonderful news arrived once more: the Queen was pregnant again. This time, the anticipation was even more intense. The first pregnancy had proven it was possible. This one had to be it. The hopes of an entire nation were focused on Antoinette's swelling belly. The stakes were absolute. The birth, when it came in October, was a stark contrast to the chaotic, near-fatal circus of the first. You, Louis, had learned your lesson. You were determined not to let your wife's life be endangered by the absurdities of royal protocol. You gave strict orders. The public would not be admitted. Access to the birthing chamber was restricted to a small number of family members and essential medical personnel. You put your wife's safety above the ancient, ridiculous tradition. It was another sign of your growing confidence and decisiveness, at least within your own family. The labor was long and difficult, but the environment was calm and controlled. Finally, the baby was born. A profound silence fell over the room as the doctors examined the child. And then, the words that France had been waiting to hear for 11 long years were spoken. Monseigneur le Dauphin. My lord, the Dauphin. It was a boy. The news was a political earthquake. The succession was secure. The Comte de Provence's ambitions were thwarted. The Franco-Austrian alliance had borne its ultimate fruit. You, Louis XVI, had fulfilled your single most important dynastic duty. You were no longer the boy who couldn't, or the king who had only produced a daughter. You were the father of the future King of France. The official announcement was met with an explosion of national joy. This is a key historical moment. The public celebrations were genuine and ecstatic. In Paris, cannons boomed, church bells rang, and strangers embraced in the streets. Free wine flowed from fountains, and fireworks lit up the night sky. For this brief, shining moment, the monarchy was genuinely popular. All the years of slander and mockery seemed to wash away in a tide of celebration. You and Antoinette were, at long last, the perfect royal family: a king, a queen, a princess, and now, the all-important Dauphin. Here's a wonderful little detail that captures the mood. A huge crowd of market women, the famous Boissardes of Les Halles, marched to Versailles. They were a rowdy, powerful, and politically active group, and their support was considered a barometer of public opinion. They were granted an audience with the Queen, and they joyfully sang rude, celebratory songs in her honor, celebrating her fertility and the birth of the heir. Louis Joseph, Antoinette, far from being offended by their earthiness, was reportedly delighted by their genuine happiness. It felt like a moment of true connection between the crown and the common people. But this is where a tragic historical irony casts a long shadow over the celebration. The birth of the Dauphin should have been the event that cemented the monarchy's future. But was it already too little? Too late? This is a central debate among historians. One school of thought argues that this was a genuine high point, a moment of real opportunity. Had you, Louis, Been able to build on this wave of goodwill with decisive political and economic reforms, you might have saved your crown. The problem, they argue, wasn't the public's attitude at this moment, it was your subsequent failure to lead. Another, more pessimistic school of thought argues that the damage was already done. The preceding 11 years, 7 years of childlessness followed by 4 years with only a daughter had inflicted a wound on the monarchy's prestige that could never fully heal. The libel-lists had done their work. The image of you as a weak, incompetent ruined of Antoinette as a frivolous, foreign spendthrift was deeply embedded in the public consciousness. A few days of fireworks and cheering could not erase over a decade of corrosive disrespect. The birth of the Dauphin was like putting a fresh coat of paint on a house whose foundations were already rotten. It looked good for a while, but it couldn't stop the inevitable collapse. For you and Antoinette, however, this was the peak of your lives. You had a family. You had an heir. You had, it seemed, overcome the personal failures that had defined the first decade of your reign. You were devoted parents. The Dauphin, Louis Joseph, was by all accounts a bright and promising boy, and you both doted on him. The future of the Bourbon dynasty seemed to be in his small hands. You couldn't know, of course, the terrible tragedies that lay ahead. You couldn't know that this healthy, celebrated boy would be plagued by illness and die just before the revolution exploded. You couldn't know that the very crowds cheering your name in the streets would one day be calling for your heads. In this moment of triumph, basking in the glow of the fireworks, you felt secure. The long, awkward, humiliating chapter of your youth was finally, definitively over. But a new, far more dangerous chapter was about to begin. The birth of a Dauphin was a triumph, a moment of pure, unadulterated political victory. It should have been the final scene of the drama, the happy ending that reset your public image and secured your reign. But reputations, once shattered, are not so easily mended. The 11-year saga of your marital difficulties had inflicted a deep and permanent wound on the prestige of the crown. The ghosts of the impotent king and the Baron Austrian were not so easily banished. They lingered in the public imagination, ready to be reanimated at the first sign of trouble. Think of it like this: for more than a decade, the central story about the monarchy had been one of failure, personal, sexual, and dynastic failure. This narrative had been amplified by the court gossips and cemented by the pornographic poison of the libel-lists. This is the crucial point: you had lost control of your own story. The caricatures had become more real to the public than the complex, flawed human beings you actually were. For you, Louis, the label of the weak, indecisive, bumbling husband had stuck, even after you fathered 2, and eventually 4, children. The image of you as an ineffectual fool persisted. It was too good a story to let go. When you later faced political and economic crises, your opponents didn't need to invent a new line of attack, they just repurposed the old one. Your perceived inability to manage your own bedroom became a powerful metaphor for your inability to manage the kingdom's finances or to stand up to the privileged nobles. Every hesitation, every moment of indecision, was seen not as careful deliberation, but as a confirmation of that original, fundamental weakness. The nickname the satirists gave you, the Royal Locksmith, was no longer about sex, it was about your fumbling, inept attempts to fix the broken machinery of the state. But the reputational damage was far more severe for Marie Antoinette. For her, the label of Madame Deficit, which had begun during her childless years of escapist spending, became an immovable stain. Her past extravagance was now the lens through which all her actions were viewed. The birth of her children did not transform her into a beloved maternal figure for long. Instead, her role as a mother was itself weaponized against her. Here's a specific, telling example. Her devotion to her children, which was genuine and intense, was twisted into another sign of her supposed un-Frenchness and dereliction of duty. Traditional French royal mothers were distant figures who handed their children over to a vast staff of governesses and tutors. Antoinette's hands-on, affectionate approach was seen as a strange, foreign, Habsburg sentimentality. Worse, her focus on her private family life at the Petit Trianon was portrayed as a selfish retreat from her public duties as Queen of France. She was accused of trying to turn the French monarchy into a cozy, bourgeois Austrian family, ignoring the grand, public nature of her role. This is where historical debate centers on the concept of recoverability. Could Antoinette ever have won over the French public? Some biographers argue that she was trapped in a no-win situation. When she was childless, she was condemned for being frivolous and barren. When she became a devoted mother, she was condemned for being reclusive and sentimental. When she embraced high fashion, she was Madame Deficit. When she later adopted a simpler style, she was accused of trying to ruin the French silk industry and disrespecting her station. The goalposts were constantly shifting. This school of thought suggests that the animosity towards her, fueled by misogyny and xenophobia, was so entrenched that nothing she did could have redeemed her. She was hated for who she was, not just for what she did. Other historians are less forgiving. They argue that she repeatedly failed to understand the basic rules of public relations. She continued to surround herself with her exclusive circle of friends, distributing lavish pensions on favors to them, which bred resentment among the older, established nobility. She failed to see that even as a mother, her primary role was a public one. She misread the political climate again and again, seeing attacks on her as personal insults rather than as symptoms of a kingdom in deep distress. The damage was not just an image problem, it had real political consequences. Because your reputations were so poor, you had very little political capital to spend when you truly needed it. When you later tried to enact desperately needed financial reforms that would have required the privileged classes to pay their fair share of taxes, you were met with ferocious resistance. Your opponents didn't just argue against the policies, they attacked you personally. The reform attempts were framed as the latest blunder from a weak-willed king, easily manipulated by his spendthrift Austrian wife and her greedy friends. The years of character assassination had stripped you of the authority and respect needed to push through unpopular but necessary changes. So the birth of the Dauphin, the moment that should have been a great reset, was in fact just a brief intermission. The fundamental damage to your credibility as rulers was already done. The public had been trained for over a decade to see you not as their sacred monarchs, but as a punchline. The laughter had soured into contempt, and that contempt was slowly hardening into rage. The personal tragedy of your first 7 years of marriage was now transforming into a national political tragedy of epic proportions. Just when you thought your public image couldn't possibly get any worse, along comes a scandal so perfectly crafted, so diabolically ingenious, that it seems to have been designed in a laboratory for the specific purpose of destroying Marie Antoinette's reputation forever. It is the affair of the diamond necklace, and it is a perfect storm of greed, ambition, and masterful deception that you, the royal couple, walk into completely unaware. The story begins not with you, but with a fabulously expensive and somewhat cursed piece of jewelry. A pair of Parisian jewelers, Baumer and Bassenge, have spent years collecting the most magnificent diamonds in Europe to create a necklace of unparalleled splendor. It is a monstrous, gaudy cascade of 647 diamonds, weighing almost 800 carats. Their intended buyer was Louis XVI, for his mistress Madame du Barry, but the old king died before the purchase could be made. No. The jewelers are stuck with an item so astronomically expensive, around 1.6 million livres. A sum that could fund an naval expedition that literally no one in Europe can afford it. Except, perhaps, a king. They offer it to you, Louis, as a gift for your wife. You show it to Antoinette. She, for once, shows remarkable restraint. She knows her reputation as Madame Deficit is already a huge liability. She is genuinely trying to be more frugal. She looks at the garish necklace and reportedly says something to the effect of, "We have more need of ships than of necklaces." She turns it down flat. A sensible, politically astute decision. But it won't save her. Now, into the villains of our story. First, There is the Cardinal de Rohan, a high-ranking churchman from one of France's most powerful families. He is ambitious, vain, and deeply out of favor at court. He is desperate to get back into the Queen's good graces, as he believes her dislike is holding back his career. He is, in short, a perfect mark. And then there is the mastermind Jean de Valois Intrigue, who calls herself the Comtesse de la Motte. She is a cunning, charismatic grifter, a descendant of an illegitimate royal line, who has clawed her way into the fringes of high society. She senses the cardinal's desperation and sees an opportunity. This is the central part of the historical event, the con. Jean de la Motte convinces the Cardinal de Rohan that she is a secret, intimate confidant of Marie Antoinette. This is a complete lie. She has barely ever met the Queen. She tells Rohan that the Queen secretly desires the diamond necklace, but cannot buy it publicly because of her reputation. Jean claims the Queen wants him, the Cardinal, to act as her secret intermediary to acquire it. To prove her connection, Jean stages a series of brilliant deceptions. She forges letters from the Queen to the Cardinal, full of warm, friendly language, promising to restore him to favor. Here's the most audacious and bizarre detail of the whole scam. To seal the deal, Jean arranges a clandestine nighttime meeting in the gardens of Versailles. She hires a local Parisian prostitute who bears a passing resemblance to Marie Antoinette, dresses her in a white gown similar to the one the Queen famously wore, and has her meet the Cardinal in a shadowy grove. In the darkness, this impostor hands Rohan a rose and whispers a few words of forgiveness. The Cardinal is completely fooled. He is now convinced he is the Queen's secret agent and beloved friend. The trap is sprung. Rohan, on the Queen's behalf, negotiates with the jewelers to buy the necklace on an installment plan. He signs the contract and hands the multi-million livre necklace over to Jean de la Motte, who promptly has her husband take it to London to be broken up and sold off, piece by piece. The first payment comes due. The jewelers, not having heard from Rohan, go directly to the Queen's lady-in-waiting to present the bill, and the whole scheme collapses. Antoinette is baffled. What necklace? I never ordered a necklace. I refused it a year ago. This is where historical debate rages about your handling of the situation. You, Louis, are furious. You feel that the honor of the Queen and the crown has been attacked. Instead of handling the matter quietly, paying off the jewelers, and exiling the Cardinal to avoid a public spectacle, you choose to make an example of him on the Feast of the Assumption, one of the most important holidays, in front of the entire assembled court. You have the Cardinal de Rohan arrested in his full religious vestments and thrown into the Bastille. Your intention is to have a public trial to clear the Queen's name once and for all. This decision, many historians argue, was a catastrophic miscalculation. The public trial turned into a media circus. The French people were not inclined to believe their vilified Austrian queen over a high-ranking French cardinal from a beloved family. The libel-lessened Antime anarchist pamphleteers had a field day. They didn't see a story of a gullible cardinal and a clever con woman. They saw a story that confirmed all their worst suspicions. Of course, the Queen wanted the necklace. It fit her reputation perfectly. They painted her as a vindictive, manipulative mastermind who had entrapped the poor cardinal and was now trying to ruin him to cover her tracks. In the end, the court acquitted the cardinal, to public cheers, and convicted the Comtesse de la Motte. But in the court of public opinion, the verdict was the opposite. Marie Antoinette was judged guilty. The trial, which was meant to be her vindication, became her ultimate condemnation. It didn't matter that she was 100% innocent. The affair of the necklace cemented her image as a deceitful, extravagant, and morally bankrupt foreigner. The mud that was thrown, unjustly, had stuck for good. It was the final nail in the coffin of her public reputation. The diamond necklace affair was a public relations nightmare, but it was just a symptom of a much deeper, more dangerous problem. While the court was obsessed with gossip and scandal, the Kingdom of France was quietly going broke. For decades, the royal treasury had been bleeding money. Pinned out in the late 1782, The nation was teetering on the edge of total bankruptcy. This is the crucial historical backdrop against which the final act of your reign plays out. The reasons for this financial crisis were complex and had been building for generations. First, there was the cost of war. The 18th century was a period of almost constant, ruinously expensive global conflict. Your grandfather, Louis XVI, had fought the 7 Years' War and lost. You, in a bid to get revenge on Great Britain, made the fateful decision to support the American Revolution, while helping to create the United States was a strategic victory. It was a financial catastrophe for France. You poured money, troops, and naval resources into the American cause, pushing the royal treasury from a state of distress into a state of critical emergency. Second, and this is the core of the problem, the French tax system was a masterpiece of injustice and inefficiency. It was a chaotic patchwork of different rules and exemptions that had been accumulating for centuries. The single biggest flaw was that the wealthiest segments of society, the clergy, the first estate and the nobility, the second estate, were largely exempt from paying direct taxes. The primary tax, the taille or land tax, fell almost entirely on the shoulders of the common people. The third estate. This meant that the burden of funding the state and its expensive wars fell on the people least able to afford it, the peasants, the urban workers, and the burgeoning middle class. This is where the public perception of your personal spending, especially Antoinette's, becomes so politically explosive. Was her spending the cause of the national debt? Absolutely not. This is a key historical fact often misunderstood. The cost of her wardrobe, the Petit Trianon, and all her parties, while extravagant, was a mere drop in the ocean compared to the state's military expenditures and debt interest payments. It was a rounding error in the royal budget. In the public mind, this distinction didn't matter. Her visible extravagance became a powerful and convenient symbol for the entire system's corruption and inequality, while the abstract concept of state debt was hard for a peasant to grasp. The image of the queen buying a diamond necklace even though she didn't, or building a fantasy village, was simple, infuriating, and easy to understand. Madame Deficit was a much better villain than a complex system of inherited fiscal privilege. Your wife became the scapegoat for a century of financial mismanagement. This leads to a fascinating historical debate. Why didn't you, Louis, fix the system? The truth is, you tried. You were not a clueless monarch oblivious to the problem. You were well aware of the impending disaster. Over the course of your reign, you appointed a series of intelligent and reform-minded finance ministers, men like Turgot, Necker, and Coligny. They all came to the same logical conclusion: the only way to save France was to overhaul the tax system and make the privileged daughters pay their fair share. But every single attempt at reform was met with ferocious opposition from the very people it would affect. The nobles and the clergy, entrenched in their ancient privileges, refused to budge. They used their influence in the parliament, test the high courts of justice, which were controlled by aristocrats, to block every proposed reform. They portrayed your attempts at creating a fairer tax system not as a necessary measure to save the state, but as an act of royal tyranny, an assault on their traditional rights and freedoms. Here is a detail that shows the tragic irony of your position. The very enlightened language of liberty and rights that you had supported in the American Revolution was now being used against you by the privileged classes to protect their own tax exemptions. They successfully painted themselves as the defenders of French liberty against a despotic, centralizing monarchy. So you were caught in a political vice. The people were groaning under the weight of unfair taxes. The state was hurtling towards bankruptcy. But the powerful, privileged elite, who held all the institutional power, blocked you at every turn. Your reputation as a weak and indecisive king made things worse. When you tried to push hard, you were accused of tyranny. When you backed down in the face of opposition, you were seen as confirming your own weakness. You were politically checkmated. By 1787, the situation was desperate. Your finance minister, Coligny, told you in no uncertain terms that the state was out of money. The pity bank was empty. The only option left was a radical, last-ditch attempt to force the issue. You decided to convene an assembly of notables, a hand-picked gathering of the most powerful elites in the kingdom, to try to persuade them to accept the reforms. It was a desperate gamble to bypass the obstructionist parlementaires. The future of your kingdom now rested on your ability to convince a room full of the richest and most powerful people in France to voluntarily give up their most cherished privilege, the privilege of not paying taxes. It was a long shot, and everyone knew it. The Assembly of Notables convenes in 1787, and it is a spectacular failure. The hand-picked elites, gathered in a grand hall in Versailles, do exactly what you feared they would. They listen politely to your minister's dire warnings of national bankruptcy, and then they flatly refuse to approve any meaningful reform. They argue that only a true representation of the nation and Estates General has the authority to approve new taxes. This is a brilliant political move on their part. They sound like champions of the people, all while protecting their own wallets. In reality, they are kicking the can down a very dangerous road, and you are forced to dismiss them in frustration. The failure of the Assembly of Notables marks a crucial turning point. The crisis is now fully public. The government's weakness is exposed for all to see, and the calls for an Estates General, an ancient, medieval representative body that hasn't met in 175 years, grow from a whisper to a roar. This is where the laughter curd a less into loathing. The long-running public mockery of your personal life now merges seamlessly with the political and economic crisis. The two streams of discontent become one powerful, raging river of public anger. The jokes about your inability to manage your wife are now jokes about your inability to manage your kingdom. The slander against Marie Antoinette as Madame Deficit is no longer just court gossip, it's presented as the primary cause of the nation's financial ruin in thousands of angry pamphlets. The focus of the libel-less begins to shift, while the pornographic attacks on the Queen continue. They are now joined by a more direct and potent form of political critique. The abstract concept of monarchy itself comes under fire. Writers and thinkers, inspired by the American Revolution and Enlightenment ideals, start to ask dangerous questions. Why should a nation of 25 million people be subject to the absolute will of one man? Especially a man widely seen as incompetent. Why should ancient, inherited privileges determine a person's rights and tax burden? The very foundations of the old regime are being questioned, not just in the salons of intellectuals, but in the cafes and public squares of Paris. A key historical development here is the changing nature of public opinion. It's no longer just about disliking the king and queen as individuals. It's about a growing contempt for the entire system they represent. The monarchy, which for centuries had been seen as a sacred institution, is now increasingly viewed as an irrational, unjust, and parasitic one. Your personal failings have made it easy for people to lose faith in the institution itself. You have become the poster children for monarchical incompetence. Here's a specific and telling detail: the diamond necklace portrait. After the disastrous affair, a new official portrait of Marie Antoinette is commissioned. It depicts her in a simple dress, surrounded by her children. The intention is to rebrand her as a modest, maternal figure, the loving mother of France. But the public's reaction is brutal. They mockingly nicknamed the painting Madame Deficit, pointing to the hole she's dug in the treasury. Even her children are now seen as props in a cynical PR campaign. Every attempt you make to reclaim the narrative backfires. You have lost all credibility. The political situation spirals out of your control. Faced with a bankrupt treasury and an intractable aristocracy, you are left with no choice. In 1788, you finally cave to the pressure. You agree to convene the Estates General. It is a moment of profound surrender. You are admitting that you, the absolute monarch, cannot solve the kingdom's problems alone. You are asking the nation for help. This decision is debated by historians to this day. Was it an act of weakness, the final abdication of your royal authority, or was it a courageous, if desperate, attempt to build a new consensus and save the state? Some argue that by calling the Estates General, You unleashed forces you could never hope to control, effectively signing the death warrant of the old regime. Others contend that you had no other move to make. It was the only card left in your hand. As 1788 draws to a close, an uneasy silence falls over France. The country is buzzing with anticipation. Elections are held for the three estates. People are writing Cahiers deed or lances, notebooks of grievances, listing their hopes and demands for the coming assembly. For many, it feels like a moment of incredible hope, the dawn of a new era of reform and justice. But for you, sitting in the gilded halls of Versailles, it must feel like the ground is crumbling beneath your feet. The private joke that began in your bedroom 7 years earlier has escaped and mutated into a public monster. The initial snickers about your sexual failings have transformed into a roar of political rage. The contempt for you as a man has become contempt for your very crown. You have summoned the nation to solve a financial crisis. But what is coming to Versailles is a revolution. And it is a revolution that your own personal history helped to fuel. The spring of 1789 arrives, not with the usual gentle promise, but with a tense, electric hum in the air. The delegates of the Estates General are pouring into Versailles from every corner of the kingdom. You see them on the streets, a sea of faces, the sober, determined black coats of the Third Estate, the proud silks of the nobility, the rich purples of the clergy. They have come to fix the kingdom's finances, but they have brought with them the hopes, dreams, and resentments of a nation. This is the quiet before the storm, the deep, indrawn breath before the scream. From a window in the palace, you look out at this gathering storm, and it's impossible not to trace it all back, to see the long, crooked line that connects this moment of national crisis to a quiet, awkward bedroom almost 2 decades ago. This is the final, tragic summation of our story. Your most private failure became the crack in the crown, a tiny fissure that, under pressure, widened until the entire edifice of the monarchy began to crumble. Think back. The failure to consummate the marriage on that first night was the seed. It wasn't a state secret, it was the hottest gossip in Europe. That seed of ridicule grew into a plant of contempt. Your retreat into your hobbies, his locks and his hunting, was seen not as a coping mechanism but as proof of your indifference and inadequacy. Her retreat into fashion and parties was not seen as a response to loneliness, but as proof of her foreign frivolity. The two of you, in your separate escapes from your shared failure, managed to create the perfect pincer movement against your own reputations. You became the weak fool, she became the wicked spendthrift. When the libelous needed a narrative, you had already written the first draft for them. They just had to add the pornographic illustrations. The personal humiliation you both endured stripped you of the one thing a monarch needs to rule effectively: mystique. The sacred aura of kingship dissolved in a puddle of public mockery. And so, when you needed to be strong, you were already perceived as weak. When you needed the nation's trust to solve the financial crisis, you were already seen as the problem. When you tried to enact reforms, the public didn't see a king trying to save his country, they saw a cuckolded husband being bossed around by his Austrian wife and her greedy friends. The affair of the necklace wasn't a bizarre one-off scandal, it was the grand finale of a long-running play whose theme was your collective incompetence. It was believed because it was believable. Because you had spent a decade inadvertently convincing the public that she was capable of such things. And here, in the midst of this political storm, fate delivers one last, devastatingly personal blow. As the Estates General bickers over voting procedures, your eldest son, the Dauphin Louis Joseph, the boy whose birth was meant to solve everything, is dying. He has been suffering from tuberculosis of the spine, and in June 1789, just as the revolution is about to find its voice, he succumbs to the illness. He is only 7 years old. The heir that took you 7 years to conceive, the symbol of the dynasty's future, is gone. You are now parents grieving a child in a palace that is rapidly becoming a prison, while the nation you are supposed to be leading is too busy arguing about its own future to mourn with you. The tragic irony is almost too cruel to bear. The solution arrived too late and was snatched away too soon. This leads us to the final, great historical debate that hangs over your reign. Was the French Revolution inevitable? Was the old regime so rotten, so fundamentally unjust, that it was destined to collapse no matter who was on the throne? Many historians argue yes. They point to the deep structural problems: the tax system, the rise of the bourgeoisie, the spread of Enlightenment ideas, and say that you were simply the unlucky monarch holding the lit fuse when the bomb finally went off. In this view, your personal saga was just a sideshow, a colorful but ultimately irrelevant chapter in a much larger story. But other historians are not so sure. They argue for the power of contingency. They believe that leadership matters. What if a stronger, more decisive, more charismatic king had been on the throne? What if the queen had been a shrewder political operator? What if your marriage hadn't been a public joke for a decade, and you had faced the financial crisis with your authority and reputation intact? Could you have navigated the storm, steered France towards a constitutional monarchy, and avoided the bloodshed of the terror? We will never know. It remains one of the great what-ifs of history. But what you do know, standing at that window in 1789, is that the delegates of the Third Estate have just declared themselves a National Assembly. They have taken an oath on a tennis court not to disband until they have given France a constitution. They are no longer looking to you for answers. They are looking at each other. The quiet is over. You can hear the footsteps of the crowd in the courtyard. A sound like distant thunder, getting closer. The storm has arrived. And so, the story comes to its turbulent conclusion. The echoes of that history, the shouting and the chaos, begin to fade now. Let them recede. Feel them become as distant as the stars outside your window. The grand halls of Versailles dissolve into soft shadows, the gold leaf flaking away into dust motes dancing in a moonbeam. The powdered wigs drift away like passing clouds. The whispers of the court, which were once so loud, are now just a gentle murmur, lost in the soft, steady hum of the fan in your room. The weight of a kingdom is no longer on your shoulders. There is only the gentle weight of your blanket, a comforting pressure that grounds you in the quiet of this moment. The only duty you have now is to let go, to let your thoughts soften and blur at the edges, like watercolor paint on wet paper. Feel your breathing slow down, a quiet rhythm. In doubt, there are no more crises to solve, no more expectations to meet. There is only this bed, this darkness, this peace. You are safe now, drifting on the edge of a dream. The end of the article. Good night.